Hey everyone, it's Hacks. Today I'm going to tell you some dark secrets about the Melee community because I think it's about time for people to hear them. Unlike most of my videos, today's video is not going to be addressed toward just the Melee community, but rather the esports community as a whole. That's because I value a safe future for everybody in esports, and I happen to know that the Melee community is currently engaging in a pattern of behavior that threatens not only itself, but the rest of the esports world as well. Unfortunately, I've watched my entire community be subjugated by this threat over the years, and it doesn't seem that anyone else sees what I see anymore. If they do, then they're either too paralyzed with fear to make an impact, or they lack the platform to do so. At first, I didn't want to give the esports world the red pill on what was going on within the Melee community. I saw that people were living happily in ignorance, and I didn't want to change that. But it seems that every year that goes by, the situation only gets worse. What drew the line for me was when I saw that the filmmaker Samox recently announced that he'd be releasing an edited version of the metagame documentary, which is set to air this weekend. I'm eventually going to explain why it should actually be illegal for this documentary to air, and why the Melee community needs to wake up to what's going on. For those who don't know me, let me introduce myself and explain why you should trust this video. I've been in the Melee community for 16 years, having been a top player for many of those years. Throughout my career, I've proved myself to not only be a top player, but also a top influencer for the community. Although I only have a moderate following, I've helped the Melee scene make technological progress in at least 5 major ways. The most notable thing I've done is create an ergonomic controller called the Box, which thousands of Melee players now use in order to avoid injuring their hands and wrists. But I've also done several other things. In 2017, I advocated for in-game software mods that gave quality of life improvements to GameCube controller users. These were adopted later that year. Then, in 2019, I explained why Melee needed an anti-stalling rule called the ledge grab limit. This rule set change was approved shortly afterward as well. Later in 2019, I started hosting a weekly tournament series called Hacks' Nightclub, which showed people that it was viable to play Melee on LCD monitors. Through the use of the latest technology, my tournament series gave people a glimpse at what Melee might look like in the future. And finally, starting in 2020, I began making educational videos that taught people about intricate Melee mechanics. All my videos went into great detail about mechanics that people had never heard of before, and were fact-checked several times for accuracy. I recommend checking out those videos if you haven't already, because today's video will be somewhat similar. Something to know about all the innovations I just described is that they all went against the grain. These were all radical ideas at first, but I helped show that they were the right direction for the community to go in. Today's video will go against the grain as well. However, today's video will have to do with politics rather than technology. People may not realize this, but the Melee community's politics are in shambles right now. There's something unthinkably evil going on right in front of our eyes here within the Melee community, and I have the evidence to prove it. Today's video will be tough to stomach, but the longer people remain ignorant, the worse the situation will get, so we don't have a choice anymore. The most difficult part about this video will be accepting that the evil I'm referring to is being perpetrated by a community leader. There's a quote that goes, "The greater the crime perpetrated by the leadership, the less likely the people will ever believe their leader's capable of perpetrating such an event." That is, unfortunately, a Hitler quote, but it's one that's very applicable to the current situation. There's a community leader who has caused this community to be filled with hatred, corruption, and greed, which are all things that the Smash community once didn't have. These things have become so normalized that the current generation of players doesn't even seem to realize what's going on, and that things weren't this way before. People are genuinely clueless that darkness has been cast over the entire Smash community, but hopefully this video will change that. Before I go any further, let me be clear about the magnitude of this video. This video is the final line of defense against someone who will continue to threaten the well-being of the Smash community, as well as surrounding esports communities if he isn't stopped. The situation will endlessly get worse, to the point that it'll become comparable to a reign of terror within esports. I know this to be true based on 3 factors. The first one is psychology. I've studied psychology extensively in order to bring you this video, and I know exactly what type of cloth this person is cut from. I'll be explaining what constitutes a supremely evil person, as well as how to spot one. I'll also be going over proven strategies for manipulating people, especially large crowds of people, that have been used on several occasions. While it is bad that I'll be showing you how to manipulate people, it's worse for you not to know how the Smash community has repeatedly been manipulated. Finally, I'll be explaining how people with these personality traits view their so-called fans and supporters, and even some of the people who think that they're their friends. The next factor is history. I've been studying history so that I can show you that what is happening within the Smash community is one-to-one with what happened in societies that collapsed. We're setting ourselves up for a dystopia in more ways than people know, and an entire culture shift is going to be necessary to fix things. Finally, I'll piece everything together with classified information that nobody else has access to. Most importantly, you need to know the truth about Evidence.zip, which is a collection of documents that was put together 8 years ago. Evidence.zip is the red pill because it reveals an MO that hasn't changed, and has only evolved as time has gone on. The press has continuously lied to you about Evidence.zip, and so you'll need to drop everything you currently know about it. Evidence.zip will reveal that several events that have occurred in recent years were politically motivated in ways that the Smash community didn't realize, and that there was an agenda in motion the entire time. I'll also be backing everything up with my own personal experiences. I've been withholding a ton of information for this inevitable moment, and it's time to release all of it. Something I want to apologize in advance for is the fact that I'm going to betray several people's trust in me in order to bring you the full truth today. Private information must be leaked in order to tell the full story, and so I'm sorry to everyone who that affects. One last thing I want to go over is why I believe this is a groundbreaking video. This video is a case study for how a community can be uprooted without even realizing it. It will show how platforms such as Twitter, Twitch, and YouTube can be weaponized in the modern-day era of social media, and how laws should be implemented to ban certain strategies when it comes to these platforms. Similarly, this video will show how we as a society underestimate the impact of political and psychological crimes, and how we can't underestimate crimes that affect socioeconomics and people's mental health. It will also show how the esports universe provides the perfect platform for criminology. By constantly using the excuse that someone is a heel, they become able to exploit their community endlessly without ever being held accountable. All these things are injustices that call for reform. Most notably, this video calls for an entire community to undo its way of thinking. There's a cult of personality that needs to be broken up within the Smash community, and I have a feeling it will be after people find out what they become a part of. This is a story of political and psychological warfare that took place in front of your very eyes over the course of the past decade. As the only person in the entire world capable of telling you this story, I know that I have to, as it has the potential to change the timeline we live in. 2 years ago, ESAM emerged as a whistleblower who stated that he was tired of Leffen shaping the discourse wherever he went within the Smash community, and having people blindly follow him as well. ESAM's posts did incredibly well on Twitter and Reddit. They were clearly representative of something that lots of people had felt, but may not have had the platform or the courage to express. For those who don't know, ESAM is an Ultimate player with about 150,000 followers nowadays, making him a notable influencer. Meanwhile, Leffen is a Melee player with about 300,000 followers, making him the current biggest influencer in the Smash community. Leffen's influence is the biggest when you consider not only his follower count, but also the credibility that's been assigned to him. It seems that whenever Leffen speaks, his opinions are regarded as factual, which is what led to ESAM's frustrations. Unfortunately, ESAM's feud with Leffen would eventually fizzle out. The two would become somewhat cordial with each other, and the concerns ESAM raised would be forgotten. This is standard when you look at how a lot of feuds with Leffen go. One day someone will be beefing with Leffen, and then a few months later they'll be subjugated by him. This leads to awkward relationships with Leffen that feel very forced. The reason this happens is because people eventually realize that beefing with Leffen will cause you to be at war for the rest of your life, and so they give up. Leffen then gets his way, and the cycle of abuse repeats itself. In ESAM's case, a whistleblower who raised very valid concerns was lost when he decided that he wasn't willing to keep going. Because time is running out for the Smash community, I'd like to reopen the case. In this video, I'm going to explain to you why Leffen is a disease that can be expected to fully erode the Smash community as well as several other esports communities within the next 10 years. I say this as someone who has known Leffen for exactly 10 years and knows exactly how predictable his trajectory is in terms of both scope and malicious intent. The Smash community simply doesn't understand the crimes that Leffen has already gotten away with, and will continue to get away with if the status quo is upheld. If you've read up on why Leffen was banned back in 2013, then it should be obvious that there's something fishy going on within the Smash community. When Armada issued Leffen's ban back then, he described Leffen as a chronic liar with no credibility whatsoever, and he encouraged people to always assume that Leffen is lying when he speaks badly of other people. Yet, 6 years later, and Leffen was able to terrorize the Ultimate community with opinions that people treated as factual. In the Melee community, there's a similarly strange disconnect. On one hand, there's the widespread belief that Leffen is a former villain who emerged as a hero, yet on the other hand, Leffen has clearly instilled fear into the current generation of players. This fear is entirely warranted when you consider that Leffen randomly attacks people with small follower counts, even going as far as to ignore their requests to be left alone. There seems to be no one truly safe from Leffen's wrath anymore, and so it makes sense for people to be on their toes. There's only one type of society in which these disconnects exist, and that is a totalitarian society. Under totalitarianism, it may not be entirely clear whether those in charge are truthful and heroic or not. This is because while they give their citizens a place to live, totalitarians deprive their citizens of basic rights by controlling the press, performing mass surveillance, and resorting to state terrorism, which is when the state attacks its own citizens in order to instill fear. The reality is that totalitarians are neither truthful nor heroic, but they make their citizens think they are in order to mobilize them. This is done through either manipulation or force. What totalitarians will commonly do is craft false hero narratives through the vilification of others. They'll create a problem and then they'll solve it for you in order to create the illusion that they're heroic. This is why it's important to take a look at where someone's hero status came from, as it could very well be a facade. In Leffen's case, what you'll eventually find is that his hero status was entirely self-engineered. Everything Leffen is remembered as a hero for was a political heist in ways that people didn't consider, and his motivations are much darker than people realize. In general, people don't oscillate between being villainous and heroic in the real world, and if you ever see a disconnect like this one, then it probably means that you've been duped. What happened here is a villain realized that hero status would be beneficial, and so he made it his goal to obtain it. If you look at the current state of the Smash community, it is in line with the totalitarian regime, and that is entirely because of Leffen. It's obvious that Leffen wants full control over the community based on several of his tendencies. A dead giveaway of Leffen's intentions is the fact that he blocks anyone who disobeys him on Twitter, to the point that he probably has thousands of people blocked. This strategy isn't being used by some random person either. It's being used by the person with the highest follower count in the community. When you think about how dangerous this strategy can become over time, it should actually be illegal, and I'll explain why. The beauty of Twitter is that no matter how few followers you have, you can always make an impact. This is because when someone makes a bad tweet, you can always make a very visible reply to it, which is why you see low follower accounts ratioing high follower accounts all the time. When enough people reply negatively to a tweet, the tweet can end up looking terrible. To the person with the high follower account, the people replying are like pests in this case. They're practically latching onto the tweet with a hook shot, and when enough of them do this, it can have a huge impact. However, what the person with the high follower account can do in response is block every single person who dissents from their tweets. I call this strategy pest control. Over time, pest control has a damaging effect on the population because of the way crowd psychology works. Let's say that there are 10 Leffen supporters and 10 Leffen dissenters to begin with. All 20 of these people have an equal right to free speech, and so Leffen's tweets are met with equal discourse on both sides. As time goes on, Leffen makes it clear that he will block every single person he views as a pest. The first thing this does is it scatters the Leffen dissenters. They can no longer reply to Leffen's tweets, which causes them to lose their power in numbers. Because the dissenters' personal profiles are powerless on their own, the supporters are now at an unfair advantage. At this point, the dissenters can choose to do one of three things. The first thing they can do is keep tweeting on their personal profiles, which, like I just said, has no impact. This leads to the second thing they can do, which is give up and stop tweeting. It is highly likely for a dissenter to choose this option once they realize that they will most likely just get harassed if they keep tweeting from their personal profiles. Unfortunately, this leads to the third option. If a dissenter wants to remain involved in the conversation, then they only have one real option, and that is to turn to the dark side. By mutinying into a supporter, the dissenter is able to regain power in numbers and avoid social isolation. When you think about the effect pest control has on crowd psychology, it deserves to be illegal. It is a mass manipulation strategy that looks to encroach on people's free speech, and the only reason we didn't realize it earlier is because social media is still new to us. The reality is that by performing pest control, someone with a large following can filter out anyone who disagrees with them, and turn their social media account into a cult gathering. Pest control is nothing more than a censorship tool, and the fact that Leffen seems to have pioneered it speaks volumes. The next sign that Leffen wants control has to do with something called a preemptive defense. I'll eventually show you the article this excerpt comes from, but a preemptive defense is when someone goes out of their way to assure you that they're kind or trustworthy without any provocation from you whatsoever. Leffen happens to do this in his Twitch bio, where he states that he is honest to a fault. This is a preemptive defense that creates a false sense of trust between Leffen and his viewers, which he can then exploit. Another troubling statement in Leffen's bio is that he won't hesitate to ban trolls or idiots, which is nothing more than a delusion. In Leffen's mind, a troll or idiot is anyone who disagrees with him, which isn't normally what makes someone a troll or an idiot. The worst part is that Leffen even goes as far as to make the people he views as pests fill out unbanned forms if they want to return to his sanctuary. By forcing people to display obedience, Leffen is able to corrode the minds of the masses even further. These types of crowd psychology tactics have a dangerous effect over time, and are responsible for the disconnect I showed you earlier. Over the course of a few years, it is possible for someone using these tactics to go from being a pathological liar to being widely considered trustworthy. In addition to manipulating large crowds, Leffen also hunts down anyone who disagrees with him on practically anything. He's known to quote retweet people with microscopic followings as to embarrass them, and pressure them to delete tweets that speak negatively of him. It is rumored that he even name searches himself in order to find these people. In 2016, Leffen showed how ridiculously far he was willing to go to censor people when a content creator named Magic Scrumpy made a video called Nerfing Fox. The video didn't even necessarily imply that Fox needed nerfs, it just explained what they would theoretically look like if they happened. When Leffen saw that Magic Scrumpy had even suggested that Leffen's melee character was overpowered, he immediately began tweeting and streaming to turn his fanbase against Magic Scrumpy. This led to long-lasting beef in which Leffen seemed to want to discredit Magic Scrumpy as a content creator entirely and push him out of the melee community. Yet another thing I've noticed about Leffen is his Discord screen name, which is 2 dashes. This gives him alphabetical priority over everyone else. In this private netplay server, for example, everyone uses their regular screen name, but Leffen uses a strategic one to make people aware that he's present. Similarly, if you've ever watched Summit's online melee events, then you've probably noticed that Leffen's always commentating from a TV screen that is front and center. It seems that no matter where you go these days, Leffen is always watching, and everybody knows it.
He was right.
Yeah, funny enough, yeah. I think the scariest thing was when I did the pivot forward smash, because I immediately thought, oh no, Leffen's doing commentary, he's gonna get mad at me.
Finally, the premier Melee podcast is called the 6-4 Podcast, which is named after propaganda that Leffen has pushed onto the Melee community. He hosts this podcast alongside Mango and Zane, so you don't have much of a choice but to watch it if you want to hear what they have to say. There's something fishy going on in the Melee community, and no one wants to talk about it. When you consider how ridiculous the lengths to which Leffen has gone to control community rhetoric are, it truly feels like a surveillance program. All of this happened gradually, but surely enough, it happened. The fact that not many people noticed it happening shouldn't surprise you either, when you consider that it's standard for totalitarianism to creep up on you. As the author Pat Miller explained in the book Willfully Ignorant, the best way to take control over a people and control them utterly is to take a little of their freedom at a time, to erode rights by 1,000 tiny and almost imperceptible reductions. In this way, the people will not see those rights and freedoms being removed until past the point at which these changes cannot be reversed. This quote describes exactly what happened to the Melee community. Aside from controlled rhetoric and surveillance, the status quo of Melee is totalitarian in several other ways. The state terrorism I mentioned earlier serves a purpose, and that purpose is to instill fear in a population. As explained by an article titled The Manufacturing of Mass Psychosis, fear destabilizes a population and makes them easier to control. By instilling fear, the population is primed for the crime of menticide, which means the killing of the mind. The best way to do this is to use waves of terror, which is when periods of fear are staggered with periods of calm in order to keep people on their toes. The article also warns that never before in history has there existed such effective technology for mass manipulation. Nowadays, social media allows people to quickly censor the flow of unwanted information. The same people who instilled fear can then offer a return to normalcy through a never-ending stream of propaganda. However, this comes at the expense of people's freedom. Once you realize that all the strategies I just listed are emanating from the same person, it becomes clear that a handbook is being followed. Leffen's inevitable tendency to feud with people at random has given him a hostile aura that people tend to want to steer clear of. The same exact person then floods the community with censorship, propaganda, and surveillance that we've come to accept as the norm. This pattern of behavior has only ever meant one thing historically, and none of it is a coincidence. Leffen gives off so many red flags that he's attempting totalitarianism that they're almost too easy to find. For example, one of his very first social media bios expressed genetic superiority, which is often a sign of a cruel and dehumanizing leader. Another example is the fact that Leffen has no respect for authority. He has, in fact, looked to embarrass authority on several occasions, despite the fact that we wouldn't have a scene without them.
Welcome. Thank you, but I'm not happy until every aspect of godhood is like torn away, and there's only one god, and that's me.
When interviewed in 2015, Leffen made it clear that he was intent on becoming the one true god of Melee, and that he wouldn't be satisfied until every aspect of godhood was torn to shreds. This made for great entertainment at the time, and so people didn't stop to consider the real meaning behind it. The biggest red flag of all, however, is something that no one would have ever guessed. Many studies have shown that one's personality can accurately be inferred from their social media avatar. If you think about the process that goes into choosing an avatar, this is obviously true. People will often use avatars of anime characters that represent their inner beliefs, which is why I need to raise an issue with something. Why did Leffen used to use an avatar of Light Yagami from Death Note back in 2016? If you understand who Light Yagami is, then it makes all too much sense when you consider everything else that I've told you. Light is a brilliant high school student on the outside, but an infamous political criminal on the inside, whose goal is to become the god of the new world. He's able to remain undetected for many years by outwitting everyone in his way. Essentially, Death Note is the story of a totalitarian regime that ends up casting darkness over the entire planet. The story that's unraveling right before our very eyes is strikingly similar to Death Note. The Death Note is a book that can be used to issue death sentences simply by writing someone else's name down. Should this tool fall into the wrong hands, it would terrorize an entire society. The funny thing is, Leffen is basically trying to turn his phone into the Death Note. Through the use of modern technology and a good understanding of crowd psychology, it's actually possible to create a Death Note nowadays, and people need to be wary of that. If you look at the avatars and professional photos that Leffen has used over the years, there's something in common with many of them. They're pitch black. Pitch black in terms of not only color, but tone as well. He has used avatars of demonic characters and pictures of himself grinning deviously, facing away from the camera while wearing a long black trench coat, being covered in shadows, etc. The Smash community lets Leffen play this off as though it's a villain persona, but what they fail to realize is that this all started long before Leffen was anyone relevant in the scene. Ever since Leffen's very first Smash Boards avatar, he has presented himself this way. You might be wondering why all of these troubling signs seem to be coming from the same person, so I'll give you the clinical explanation. In psychology, there is a concept called the dark triad that consists of 3 antisocial personality traits: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. These traits are strictly malevolent and can be thought of as the very definition of evil itself. They are what compel people to commit crimes, and they're bound to result in social distress and severe problems for an organization, especially if the dark triad is given a leadership position. This is because dark triads are ruthless manipulators who will claw their way to the top at anyone's expense. They're also interpersonally skilled, which means that while they themselves are cold, dark triads are good at understanding other people's emotions and thought processes. The next thing to know is that Leffen is technically not a dark triad, but a dark tetrad. The dark tetrad is a slightly modified form of the triad that doesn't get talked about as much. The difference is that it adds sadism to the list. Sadism refers to the tendency to derive pleasure from inflicting pain, suffering, or humiliation onto others. Not all dark triads are sadists, but Leffen certainly is. This is obvious based on his fake yawns and patronizing pats on the back, as well as the way he conducts himself online on a regular basis. In 2012, Leffen openly confessed to sadism when he stated that he acts like a douche on the internet because he enjoys seeing other people rage, and that doing so colors these empty words. So, how do I know that Leffen isn't just a sadist, but a dark triad as well? There are a lot of ways to tell. For one, the dark triad is the motivating factor behind the totalitarian behavior I described earlier. There's also the fact that studies have shown that trolling and debating issues when posting online signal not only sadism, but also the dark triad. Leffen constantly engages in both of these activities. The correlation skyrockets with trolling in particular, which is what Leffen was originally known for. Part of what this video will do is blow the doors open on the fact that this isn't just a villain persona, but who Leffen really is, and so you'll need to understand the dark triad. The Smash community needs to hear this information, because at this rate, it'll continue to funnel resources into Leffen, and so people need to know who they're supporting. As I said earlier, the dark triad consists of 3 traits: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. Although these traits are often depicted as a triangle, it is more accurate to depict them as a Venn diagram, since they all have overlapping qualities. Furthermore, having even one of these traits makes it much more likely to have the rest. The way the dark triad works is as follows. Narcissism isn't too malevolent on its own, but it mixes horribly with the other 2 traits, making it highly malevolent in the end. This is because narcissism can be thought of as self-admiration to the point that it can be considered a disease. A narcissist needs to be the center of attention at all times and will go to great lengths to make sure it happens. They can't take any form of criticism either, and are highly insecure about their appearance. Narcissists will also engage in bad faith arguments just to abuse people. They will use faulty argumentation and lies as much as necessary to avoid losing an argument. The next trait is psychopathy, which is the most malevolent of the 3 traits. Psychopathy is characterized by antisocial behavior, which means behavior that violates the rights of other people and disrupts society. Psychopaths are also impulsive, selfish, unemotional, and remorseless. Finally, Machiavellianism refers to an ends justifies the means philosophy that involves exploiting and manipulating people in order to gain power. Machiavellians are absent in morality and have a high degree of self-interest. They believe in status over everything and will go to unbelievable lengths in order to obtain it. Machiavellianism is the most important trait to keep in mind throughout this video because if you think about it, it's the only one that isn't visible. Everything else on this list is visible if you know what to look for, but you wouldn't know how someone like Leffen has exploited the Smash community in order to serve his own interests. Among all of these traits, there are several things they have in common. Dark triads are low in agreeableness and extremely neurotic, which means they're constantly moody and angry. They also lack consciousness and empathy, which means they can't put themselves in the shoes of other people. The most important trait by far, though, is that dark triads are pathological liars. This is because all of their overarching traits benefit from lying. Earlier on, I showed you the term preemptive defense, which Leffen does by stating that he is truthful to a fault in his Twitch bio. The article this excerpt is from is titled 20 Diversion Tactics Highly Manipulative Narcissists, Sociopaths, and Psychopaths Use to Silence You. The article lists plenty of strategies Leffen uses on a regular basis if you scroll through his Twitter feed. These include gaslighting, nonsensical conversations, generalizations, misrepresentations, aggressive jabs described as jokes, a condescending and patronizing tone, and shaming. I'm not going to provide examples of these because you can easily find them by scrolling through Leffen's Twitter feed for even a few seconds. However, there's something called projection that I want to take a moment to go over since it's a little more complicated. Projection, or psychological projection, is when someone insults other people by displacing things that they know to be true about themselves. Projection is a defense mechanism that is used to avoid accountability, and in the case of truly horrific people, it can be very abusive. This is why when Leffen called Magic Scrumpy a cheater, he didn't just call him a cheater. He called him a cheater with a victim complex. It's also why Leffen told Esam that he only cares about things that benefit him, why he called Hungrybox a sociopath, and why he's referred to me as his stalker. Every single one of these tweets needs to be interpreted in the reverse direction because they're all projections, and once you understand that, it becomes clear how wicked of a person Leffen really is. The problem is that not everyone is familiar with projection, and so people actually side with Leffen when he says these things. As you can see, the signs that Leffen is a dark triad have been right in front of us the entire time. Now that you're viewing things from this perspective, I'll show you some examples of each of the 3 dark triad traits, starting with Machiavellianism.
Hey guys, it's Leffen here again. I forgot to mention that I'm going to be doing a charity stream this Friday. It's going to be for RAIN, which is the biggest anti-sexual violence charity in the United States.
The video you're watching is blatantly insincere just based on the way Leffen raises his voice. He's speaking in a high-pitched voice because he knows that he needs to appear friendly and charitable in this moment, and he doesn't actually feel those emotions. We can't forget that this is the same person who was once banned for being a chronic liar with a manipulative personality, and that this slip-up isn't merely a coincidence. Moving on to narcissism, take a look at this post Leffen made in 2011. Someone had listed a bunch of Melee sets they recommended watching, and they just so happened to sort Leffen's sets individually rather than grouping them. Leffen then commented that he liked how the way the sets were sorted placed more emphasis on himself, which is an extremely narcissistic comment to make. Additionally, Leffen refers to himself as an icon in his Twitter bio and has several heavily edited photos of himself that uphold that belief. Lastly, I'll show you an example of psychopathy. The fact that Leffen used to state that he is really mean in his social media bio is an indicator of psychopathy in itself, but I want to give you a real-world example. When I beat Leffen at Genesis 7, I was wearing a red pair of Adidas pants with white stripes on them. These pants would become synonymous with my run at that tournament. A few months after Genesis 7, someone sent me a picture they took of Leffen streaming. Leffen was wearing a red Adidas shirt with white stripes on its sleeves while editing a digital controller's button layout. Again, this wasn't a coincidence. It was a psychopath's way of showing that he wants revenge. Needless to say, the behaviors you're going to find in this video are completely bizarre, but you might be wondering why I'm making this video now. I'm making this video now because the status quo of Melee is becoming increasingly dystopian, and I've been growing increasingly discontent with it. It seems that instead of opposing the Dark Triad, we've actually embraced it as part of our culture. When Leffen randomly attacks people from other gaming communities, for example, we watch and laugh. Then, our content creators turn it into the latest news. This leads to other communities telling us to take Leffen back to the shithole he came from. Even worse is the fact that we built a bot off of Leffen's AI and used it to broadcast his mindset to thousands of people. Once you realize why the people behind Deep Leffen Bot found Leffen's personality so fascinating, it's actually a lot more dystopian than it looks. Above all else, though, there was something that happened recently that drew the line for me, and it had to do with the filmmaker named Samox. For those who don't know, Samox is the director behind the original Smash Bros. Documentary that turned Melee into a major esport back in 2013. In 2020, Samox returned to us with a new documentary called Metagame, which covered the newer generation of Melee players. However, Metagame wasn't received nearly as well, largely due to what people viewed as Leffen's character assassination. Samox had chosen to show footage of Swedes who knew about Evidence.zip, and Leffen didn't like that. Even though Metagame didn't reveal too much about Evidence.zip, it was still the current generation's only glimpse at the truth, and Leffen made it clear that he wanted it taken down. At first, Leffen complimented the first few episodes of Metagame for how incredible they were, but when the episodes that talked about Evidence.zip aired the next day, everything changed. Leffen frantically began to tweet about Metagame every several minutes. His tweets suggested that Evidence.zip was a conspiracy, and that Metagame was a terrible documentary for assassinating his character. Leffen tweeted so frequently that he seemingly went insane. He just went on and on and on, and it felt like there was no end. The next terms I'm going to introduce are called narcissistic injury and narcissistic rage. Narcissistic injury occurs when a narcissist perceives something as a serious threat to their self-esteem. It will happen if the narcissist feels that their true self has been revealed, and that people have caught on to their hidden behaviors and motivations. This triggers narcissistic rage, which when a narcissist goes insane and becomes extremely violent. Narcissistic rage happens at the end of Death Note when the police force finally close in on Light Yagami, the mastermind behind years of political crimes that terrorized the world. After realizing that he's been caught, Light begins to laugh like a maniac and contort his body in strange ways while the police force watch in awe. In real life, the way narcissistic rage works is it has two phases. The first phase is an angry outburst, and the second phase is a self-aimed wrath. This means that the narcissist will actually degrade themselves as to suggest that the way they've been insulted is preposterous. Leffen did this toward the very end of his rage when he tweeted a picture of his face edited onto a Dementor, which is a creature from Harry Potter that drains peace, hope, and happiness from the world around it. Although people saw this tweet as sarcastic, it was actually a lot more telling than they realized. The way Leffen responded to Metagame rallied the community in back of him, which put extreme pressure on Samox. Just a few hours after these episodes aired, Samox had already been forced to issue an apology statement assuring people that re-releases of Metagame would be censored to remove all Evidence.zip footage. Many people called this out as revisionist history, but their voices were ultimately drowned out. The problem with this entire situation is that if you think about it, Samox was screwed ever since the moment he decided to cover Leffen at all. This is because Samox could have gone in one of two directions with Metagame. The first one was to tell the truth, which is what he did. Samox is a professional filmmaker who's probably never not told the truth in his career, and so he approached the situation the same way as usual. But what Samox didn't know is that he was catering to an audience that had never heard the truth about Leffen before, and couldn't believe the truth when they heard it. This caused Samox to break his obligations as a filmmaker by agreeing to censor the truth. On April 24th, Samox doubled down by announcing that he'd be returning in June with a new episode of Metagame that would focus on Leffen, as well as new interview footage. In other words, propaganda. This announcement is the pinnacle of how dystopian the Melee community has become. Rather than hear the truth, we would prefer to rewrite history in a way that glorifies people who don't deserve it. It's gotten to the point that we'll ostracize filmmakers who try to do the right thing for us, and make them come crawling back to us with propaganda in order to redeem themselves. After seeing what happened to Samox, I realized that this community was desperately in need of some factual information, and so I decided to make this video. The way this generation got here in the first place was through propaganda. TSM and Red Bull committed one of the biggest sins in esports history when they decided to erase the truth about Evidence.zip and lie to people instead. The documentaries, interviews, and articles that these companies have put out in the past several years are nothing short of the most aggressive brainwashing campaign I've ever witnessed. It's almost as if nothing the media has told you is true. Leffen sponsors have made it seem as though he's a cheerful and positive role model, and they've had friends and family members testify on his behalf as well. This false narrative is amplified by interviews with other community members who know nothing about the truth either. Red Bull even titled their documentary series Evidence.zip and portrayed Leffen's ban as a hero story, as if he was a phoenix rising from the ashes. It gets worse when you consider that Leffen surely influenced the narrative of these documentaries and had final say over all of them. Now, we're somehow at the point where I'm the last one left in Smash who knows the truth. I promise you that after I tell you the truth, every single piece these companies have ever put out about Leffen will be remembered as political terrorism. Back when I showed you the quote that explains how totalitarians gradually encroach on human rights, there was an implication that things can reach the point where it is too late. This is why the quote reads, "until past the point at which these changes cannot be reversed." If you look at the current state of the media, the Smash community is rapidly approaching a checkmate situation. Leffen has professional propaganda, a social media sanctuary they created by blocking thousands of people, and a podcast named after his rhetoric. He will mob you on Twitter if you speak his name, and he has successfully defamed YouTubers whose views weren't in line with his. He's also on your TV screen when you tune into tournaments he isn't playing in. What the community is now agreeing to do is erase the one shot they had at learning the truth, and replace it with propaganda instead. The situation Samox has been forced into in order to appeal to this community is catastrophic, and goes to show how corroded we've become. Samox is a filmmaker who's been pressured to succumb to totalitarianism, but people don't realize that. People don't realize that they're witnessing the death of their free speech. Totalitarianism can be thought of as building a car. The goal is to create an empire in which everything is automated, but the hardest part is giving that empire 4 wheels and an engine. The empire needs things like a brainwashed population, means of instilling fear, loyalty, and the abolition of free press. From there, it can operate smoothly. There is no doubt that the abolition of free press is one of the most necessary steps toward these types of societies. The first thing people need to realize is that none of this is a drill. Leffen is attempting totalitarianism, and that's going to become clearer and clearer as this video goes on. The second thing people need to realize is that there is still time. Leffen may have conquered the press, but he can't undo the information I'll be giving you in this video. Once people find out what the Smash community has become, I'm hopeful that things will change. For now, I'll be listing totalitarianism as the first of many charges against Leffen. I'm now going to tell you the true story behind Evidence.zip. I'm violating multiple people's privacy by doing this, but there's no other choice. 10 years ago, I made a thread on Smash boards that advocated for a ledge grab limit being added to the Melee rule set. I knew this rule needed to be implemented for a lot of reasons, but at the time, people didn't realize that. I assured people that one day they'd realize that I wasn't kidding. The same day I made my thread, a user named Leffen went well out of his way to destroy it. Leffen and I didn't even know each other, but he came across as incredibly angry and determined to undermine my credibility. He insulted me many times and told me that I was a moron for thinking that camping the ledge is broken. 8 years later, Leffen would be begging tournament organizers to implement a ledge grab limit because of how broken camping the ledge is, according to his own words. Players like HBox and Mewtwo had shown that ledge camping needed to be banned by then, and so Leffen was now in agreement with what I'd been saying since 2011. Luckily for Leffen, I was working on a YouTube video about ledge camping around that same time. My video went in depth about why a ledge grab limit was needed, and would end up convincing the community that I was right all along. Leffen had no choice but to endorse my video at that point, but you can see how even then, he did so in a reluctant tone. The problem with today's situation is that when Leffen throws a narcissistic tantrum like the one he threw in 2011, thousands of people will actually listen to him. Back then, this wasn't as much of an issue, but it was still a huge one. As time went on, Leffen would destroy many of my threads even though I'd never done anything to him, and it began to intrude on my free speech pretty severely. In February 2012, I'd had enough, and so I condemned Leffen in a post that told him to never use my name again. I also let him know that he was a menace who would inevitably cause the community problems in the future. After I made my post, Leffen's harassment didn't just get worse, it turned into stalking. I couldn't really go anywhere on the boards without Leffen being there, and it began to affect me a lot as a teenager. Smashboards was the only form of social media back then, and so this reached the point of me not wanting to sign onto social media at all. By early 2013, things had gotten to the point where I knew that Leffen needed to be banned from the community, and so I reached out to Armada. What Armada told me in response caught me by surprise. Armada told me that there was already a team of Swedes working to ban Leffen, and that I was welcome to join them. This is how I became involved with Evidence.zip. When Armada declared Leffen's ban official on February 9, 2013, he published some but not all of Evidence.zip. This is because Evidence.zip consisted of two parts, public forum posts and private testimonies. What you're looking at is the folder that was originally distributed to the public, which contained the forum posts. I'm the one who compiled the document with Leffen's Smashboards forum posts, which is why some people think I created Evidence.zip. I didn't necessarily create Evidence.zip, because other than that, I was just another person who testified. However, it is true that I bridged the gap between Sweden and North America. The private testimonies within Evidence.zip were never released due to their private nature. I'm going to betray several of my friends by showing them to you, because the world needs to see them. Evidence.zip consisted of 3 Swedish players, 3 Swedish TOs, and 3 American players. One of the American players and all 3 of the Swedish players are what we'll call prospects. These were people who felt that Leffen had made it his goal to remove them from the Smash community. I just so happened to be the sole American prospect. Other than that, there were 5 more people who felt that what they witnessed was more than enough to warrant banning Leffen. Armada was one of those 5 people. There's also a 10th document titled Letter to Genesis 3 Staff that was written by the Swedes collectively. Genesis 3 was originally supposed to happen in summer 2013, hence the title of the letter. There's only one document I can't show you, and that is the 3rd Swedish Smasher's testimony. There are reasons I can't get into this testimony, so I'll be skipping it. Other than that, I'll be showing you excerpts from each of these testimonies. After reading these testimonies, it should be clear why I've been telling you that this community will be destroyed in another 10 years. We've been on a time bomb this entire time, and the press has done nothing but cover it up. Several of the people who testified for Evidence.zip were able to predict that Leffen had the potential to fully erode the Smash community, even internationally, if he wasn't banned. That was 8 years ago. The fact that I can look at the state of Smash in 2021 and reasonably compare it to totalitarianism means that the prophecy has become all too real. Throughout his career, Leffen has lied about the origins of Evidence.zip. Clearly, it wasn't the conspiracy he wants you to believe it was. Evidence.zip was a collective warning that Leffen is a dark tetrad with the potential to fully erode the Smash community, and the fact that this was kept hidden from people is nothing short of a travesty. An especially important quote from Evidence.zip that I want to highlight is one from Armada's testimony. This is the quote that states, "At one point, Leffen basically told me and another Swedish smasher that he thinks humans shouldn't show as much respect toward each other as they do most of the time." This quote reveals that Leffen is not only a Machiavellian, but high on the Machiavellian scale, meaning he believes that empathy is naive and that deception is necessary in order to get ahead. Essentially, high Machs view people as chess pieces that can and should be used in order to serve one's self-interests. I'm pointing this out because, as I told you earlier, Machiavellianism is the most important dark triad trait to keep in mind. It is the trait that will cause us to have to go back and reinvestigate several of the things that Leffen has done in order to determine how they may have been politically motivated. As you'll eventually find out, you should never underestimate the degree of bad faith and pathological lying that high Machs such as Leffen will utilize. Another important aspect of Evidence.zip is that it reveals Leffen's MO. From an early age, Leffen showed that he would latch onto prospects who he'd choose on a whim, then hunt them down until their careers were over. He would go to any lengths necessary to defraud these prospects, using strategies such as blackmail, gaslighting, and rumor spreading in order to ruin them. At first, these prospects seemed to be limited to those with physical or mental handicaps, but as time went on, Leffen began to target people for political reasons as well. I know this because I was the first person he chose for these purposes. In my case, Leffen seemed to dislike the fact that I had respected opinions that could potentially challenge his rhetoric, and so he wanted me gone. Unsurprisingly, Leffen has continued to target people who could challenge his market share for similar reasons in recent years. This would happen right in front of everyone's eyes, but it was well disguised, and so people failed to realize that there was a pattern. You should also know about what happened directly after Evidence.zip, because the press has lied to you about that too. Directly after Leffen was banned, he made it clear that Evidence.zip was a conspiracy and that he'd been wronged. He even said that he wanted to leave his past behind and cut ties with the Smash community. But on March 21st, 2013, Leffen had a change of heart. He suddenly decided that he was sorry for everything, and he confessed to several of the things that he had done, citing depression and anxiety as the motivating factors. The apology Leffen issued got covered by the Score Esports' documentary on him from 2018, which has 1.5 million views. It's the apology that people cite to this day, and the one that people believe is real. What the people who read Leffen's apology didn't know was that they had been manipulated. On the exact same day Leffen issued his apology to North America, he also issued statements on the Swedish forums that warned them that they had defied him. Last year I talked with one of the Swedes who testified for Evidence.zip about the fact that Leffen's apology was insincere. Although the Swedish forums are no longer accessible, he confirmed that Leffen's apology was fake. This is made even more obvious by an excerpt from the letter to Genesis 3 staff, which explains how Leffen initially responded to being banned over in Sweden. The excerpt explains that Leffen had condemned the Swedes to the point that he seemed to want to take revenge on them. The excerpt also warns the reader that Leffen is someone who will endlessly claim victim status in order to evade accountability, which is exactly what he did in his fake apology. 2 weeks after Leffen's fake apology, a tournament called Beast 3 was held in Sweden. Beast 3 was the first notable tournament that Leffen was banned from, and so the Swedes who'd been abused by him were looking forward to their first Leffen-free tournament. But what people don't know is that Leffen actually showed up to this tournament in person and tried to convince the TOs to let him in. Leffen didn't seem to understand that he was actually banned from Beast 3, and so the TOs had to physically deny him entry. Around this same time, I was emailing Mr. Wizard about banning Leffen from EVO 2013. I was transparent about the fact that this was a complicated case and that it wasn't going to be easy to convey why a ban was necessary. Unfortunately, the EVO staff would end up rejecting the case on the basis of no physical assault, which is exactly what I feared would happen. A few months later, I flew to Vegas for EVO 2013. The first night I got there, I dropped my bags off in my hotel room and went to the Rio Hotel, which was nearby. I went to the Rio because the World Series of Poker was taking place there that year, and I wanted to watch people participate in it. I ended up spending a couple of hours at the Rio before realizing that I needed to head back to my hotel room to grab my phone charger, at which point I called my friend Cody, who I was staying with. When I called Cody, I told him that I'd be heading back to the hotel to grab my charger. Cody then said to me, "Sure, but just so you know, Leffen's playing Melee in our hotel room." When Cody said that to me, it was one of the weirdest things I'd ever heard. A lot of people vaguely knew that Leffen and I had beef, but people didn't know that this was the same person I had just tried to ban from the tournament we were at. Of all the people who could have ended up in my hotel room, the fact that it was Leffen wasn't a coincidence. He wanted to cause some sort of disturbance, and he succeeded. When I got back to the hotel, I didn't actually enter my room. Instead, I had Cody hand me my phone charger at the door. Leffen sat inside of my hotel room while all of this happened. These are logs showing that I discussed the situation with Cody last year. Later that weekend, something similar happened. I had spent a lot of EVO 2013 with my childhood friend J-Man, who was approaching retirement from Melee around that time. What I noticed is that during certain parts of the weekend, Leffen would make efforts to befriend J-Man, which led to lots of awkward moments where I didn't want to approach J-Man because he was with Leffen. This exact strategy was described by one of the Swedes who testified for Evidence.zip, who stated that after he began avoiding Leffen, Leffen looked to finish him by taking his friends away from him, which caused issues in his social life. These types of interactions show the ridiculous lengths Leffen will go to torment people once they're on his hit list. As you can see, Leffen never actually expressed remorse for the actions that got him banned. In fact, he did the opposite. He made no efforts to change either, which should have been obvious based on the way he barked when he took games off of Armada at Beast 4 in 2014. The problem is that 8 years have passed since Evidence.zip, and Leffen now has the entire Smash community in his back pocket. Someone with a Dark Triad mentality is able to severely disrupt society when given this much power, and Leffen has done exactly that. However, people haven't been viewing things from this angle, and so they never saw any of it. As I said earlier, Leffen would eventually transition into a full-fledged political con artist. The goal of his cons can be summed up in one phrase: socioeconomic resource transfer. Leffen is a Machiavellian who will do anything to get ahead socioeconomically, which means he'll go to unthinkable lengths to acquire fame and fortune. Between these two things, fame is Leffen's priority. He wants people to be controlled and underneath him so that he can continue to broaden his influence. I'll be showing you how Leffen has exploited the Smash community many times in order to achieve this. Another term you should be familiar with is socioeconomic resource drain. This term is appropriate because it describes the fact that Leffen often targets people such as myself who he views as political adversaries. Leffen's goal here is to drain his adversaries socioeconomically in order to further secure his position. This is a standard strategy for achieving totalitarianism. In Nazi Germany, for example, Hitler purged a large group within the Nazi Party in 1934. He viewed the people within this group as potential threats to his ascent, and so he needed them gone. Surely enough, this scheme was instrumental in Hitler's rise. Finally, social parasite is the term we'll use to describe someone who resorts to either of these strategies. In Smash, or any community for that matter, it's an unspoken rule that your success shouldn't come at the expense of others. Social parasites like Leffen don't believe in this mentality, and so they'll gladly exploit their community and their fellow competitors in order to ascend. Unfortunately, this opens the door for all sorts of immoral ways of getting ahead that people wouldn't normally consider, which have largely contributed to where Leffen is today. Now that the stage is set, I'm going to begin listing manipulation tactics that Leffen uses on a regular basis. The first one is called the totalitarian tiptoe, or tiptoeing for short. Tiptoeing is used to get large groups of people to agree to terms that they would normally reject. This is the term that describes Leffen's gradual encroachment of free speech that I talked about earlier. As the Pat Miller quote explained, the best way to take control over a people and control them utterly is to take a little of their freedom at a time, to erode rights by 1,000 tiny and almost imperceptible reductions. In this way, the people will not see those rights and freedoms being removed until past the point at which these changes cannot be reversed. The idea here is that the best way to erode people's rights is to do it gradually so that nothing happens abruptly enough to raise eyebrows. Over time, this can cause people to fail to realize that they've agreed to massively disadvantageous terms, such as the fact that Leffen is on the verge of reaching full censorship. Basically, don't skip from A to Z or else people will notice. Instead, advance a couple of letters at a time. Now that you know about tiptoeing, I want to start by showing you that nothing has changed since Evidence.zip and that Leffen is still the same malicious person in the year 2021. At the very end of last year, I announced that I'd be hosting an online version of my tournament series Hax's Nightclub starting on January 2nd, 2021. The trailer stated that I'd be hosting a tournament every Saturday that didn't already have a tournament happening on that date. This is standard practice in the Smash community. We host tournaments for the good of the community, and so we don't overrun each other's tournaments. On January 2nd, my staff and I hosted Hax's Nightclub. There were 567 entrants and the event was a huge success, but what a lot of people didn't understand is why Hax's Nightclub never happened again after that date. The real reason is very complicated. On January 3rd, the day after I hosted Hax's Nightclub, Leffen announced that he'd be starting up a weekly tournament series called Levo. To enter Levo, people would have to subscribe to Leffen on Twitch. Levo was going to happen every Saturday, which normally would have meant that it was overrunning Hax's Nightclub. The catch, though, is that Levo was a European event, and so no one batted an eye. Not even my staff saw what Leffen had just done, but I knew precisely what this meant. Leffen was tiptoeing, and he would soon look to overrun Hax's nightclub entirely. If Leffen had announced the North American event on Saturdays, it would have raised too many eyebrows, so what he needed to do instead was take baby steps. Within a few weeks, he was inevitably going to expand Levo to North America. Once I saw this, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I was going to trade my entire tournament series to mount my case against Leffen, and so I shut down Hax's nightclub. The interesting thing, though, is that nobody knew there wasn't going to be another event. Not even my own staff knew the truth. I'd begun to lie to everybody by telling them that the next event would be on January 23rd. I even announced this in the Hax's nightclub Discord server. The reason I announced January 23rd as the next date was because there were upcoming tournaments on the next 2 weekends, and so if I was actually going to host another event, then I would have had to schedule around them. But I was only looking for one thing here, and that was to make Leffen take the next step on January 23rd. I would then be able to show this to people later. The tournament that happened the week after my event was called Galint. I ran fake ads at Galint because I needed to be absolutely sure that Leffen would see them. The ads said that the next Hax's nightclub would fall on January 23rd. Then, on January 14th, the inevitable happened when Leffen announced that the Levo he'd be hosting on January 23rd would have a North American bracket. Because of how inconspicuously Leffen slipped this in, no one even noticed that he had just overrun another tournament. January 23rd is also when Leffen would start calling it Saturday Night Levo, which is a direct shot at Hax's nightclub. Before I go any further, let me explain why this is so significant. Leffen wanted to overrun my tournament in order to weaken his longtime adversary. However, he knew that if his original announcement on January 3rd said that he'd be hosting a North American tournament on Saturdays, people would have brought up the fact that the East Coast had just gotten a major tournament series, and that he was blatantly overrunning it. So instead, Leffen started by hosting an EU-only tournament. Then, 2 weeks later, he slipped in an announcement that he'd be adding a North American bracket. This allowed Leffen to overrun Hax's nightclub without anyone noticing. The steps Leffen took reveal a high degree of Machiavellianism. Not only does this show that Leffen has the capacity to manipulate the community, but it also shows complete disregard for the community. Whereas Hax's nightclub was a free event, Levo requires you to sub to Leffen on Twitch, which means Leffen was willing to take a free event away from the community. This also shows the capacity for resource transfer, resource drain, and socially parasitic behavior. Leffen's con may have been directed at me, but he was willing to exploit the community in order to execute it. One of the reasons I shut down Hax's nightclub completely was because I wanted to see how Leffen would lie to people afterward. This would end up happening a month later. On February 27th and 28th, there was going to be a major European event called The Upset. The Upset was being held by Poilon, a company that had recently gotten into Smash. The Upset singles bracket was going to take place on Sunday, February 28th, while Leffen would host Levo on Saturday the 27th. A few days before that weekend, Leffen's narcissism kicked into full gear. He started criticizing the Upset for starting its Sunday bracket at 11 a.m., as this would make it difficult for him to host Levo, then sleep, and enter the Upset the next day. He started to make lots of other criticisms as well. Things got to the point that the Upset's head TO had to step in and tell Leffen to stop shitting on his team's hard work, and that no one was forcing Leffen to enter the Upset. The TO also accused Leffen of overrunning his event, since it would have been common courtesy for Leffen to not host Levo at all that week so that the first day of the Upset could do better. Leffen then flat out lied to the TO's face by acting as though he cares about not conflicting with other events. We know that this is a lie because Leffen actually created Levo with the intention of overrunning Hax's nightclub. These types of cons can go a long way. Levo would go on to become the official qualifier for Summit's online events, whereas it's entirely possible that Hax's nightclub would have received this partnership if not for Levo overrunning it. Like I said though, I was willing to trade my tournament series so that I could show you this. The moment I saw Leffen's announcement on January 3rd, I knew that I had the opportunity to catch him in a string of lies. The crazy part is that in January, Leffen launched not one but 2 political cons at me. While all of this was going on, there was another con aimed at the box, which is the ergonomic controller that I sell. The con began on January 5th when Leffen tweeted that he'd be live streaming a review of a box he just got in the mail. This was yet another tiptoe. Just like when Leffen tiptoed by announcing Levo, he was now tiptoeing once again. To show you how obvious it is that this was a tiptoe, consider this Instagram post that Leffen made in 2017 in which he claimed he'd be showcasing notched GameCube controllers. Leffen then posted his so-called notch showcase to YouTube and started to say things like these within the first few minutes.
Alright, so first off, one common thing that people say is like, oh, the fact that the box or the hitbox controller, so digital input, gives you perfect wave dashes isn't a big deal. You can just notch your controller to get perfect wave dashes. This even with notches, this literally never happens. Truck Jitsu said, this isn't a good reason. You can just make the box, you can just modify the box so it's less than perfect. No, you can't. It's not really that they're objectively better. It's that it's 100% consistent. It's perfect. It's far more important to be 100% consistent than 100% perfect in Melee. And that's the inherent problem with having digital input. You play outside of the rules.
Leffen's notch showcase wasn't even about notches. It was a video intended to convince you that the box needed to be banned. The only reason Leffen used a different title was to trick people into watching the video. This is why when you see Leffen claiming that he'll be reviewing the box 4 years later, he's obviously being deceptive here as well.
They both are kind of fingerprint magnets, but I think the box is worse. For the hand position for this one, I actually feel like these buttons are like too high up, but I have never seen this many cuts on anything ever. It has a billion small cuts.
Within the first few minutes of Leffen's review, it becomes pretty obvious that he's tricked people into watching a stream of him ripping into the box the entire time. I don't actually care about the comments you heard him making just now, but the comments that came afterward are the ones that would end up causing huge problems.
For me, I might actually swap so that this button is Z, so I can grab like this, and so that I can L cancel with R. Because I think L canceling with R is better than with light. A lot of people will not agree with me, but I am very sure about it.
Leffen had begun to spout factually incorrect information about L canceling in Melee. He was then using that information to tell people that the box is designed incorrectly and that 2 of its button locations should be swapped. To show you what I mean, here's a diagram of the box's button layout. The 8 buttons being highlighted in blue are called home row buttons because they're the ones that you rest your fingers on. As you can see, the Z button is on the home row. This is a crucial design decision that Leffen was contesting by telling people that Z should be swapped with R. The reason you heard him give for this is that digital L cancels, which are performed with L or R, are allegedly better than analog L cancels, which are performed by lightly pressing L or R or pressing Z. Therefore, there should be a digital L cancel button on the home row, according to Leffen. As the person who spent 4 years designing this controller, I'm going to explain in detail why Leffen's button layout should never be used. The first thing to know is that Leffen is incorrect in telling you that digital L cancels are better than analog L cancels. It's actually the other way around. I ended up having to make a YouTube video about this in February because of how much misinformation Leffen would end up spreading. There have also been other YouTube videos about why you should analog L cancel, such as the one Mike Hayes made a few years ago. Since I don't expect everyone to have seen these videos, I'll give you a brief rundown of why analog L cancels are better. Analog L canceling is better than digital L canceling because it doesn't force you to pair your L cancel input with a tech input. Even without much of an understanding of Melee, it already isn't hard to tell why analog L canceling is better. It's rarely ever best to tech at the exact same time you L cancel, and even if you wanted that, you could just manually input a tech. The first reason it's better to separate your L cancels and techs is because it increases your L cancel window. This is because when your character enters hit lag, you can input an L cancel just fine, but a tech input will actually cause a tech lockout. Meaning, if Fox presses L during hit lag in this situation, it'll become impossible for him to tech the shine that he gets hit with, and so he shouldn't do so. What Fox should do instead is analog L cancel by pressing Z during hit lag, then input a tech afterward. This lets Fox take advantage of perfectly good hit lag frames for his L cancel input. The second reason you should separate your L cancels and techs is because it increases your tech window as well. This is because if you digital L cancel, then you have to press L or R by the first landing lag frame at the latest, otherwise you won't L cancel. However, if you analog L cancel, then you become able to tech after the first landing lag frame. Since you often don't get punished until several frames after you land, this means you increase your tech window. The explanation I just gave can be visualized with this graph, which shows that analog L cancels let you take advantage of hit lag frames for L canceling without locking yourself out of tech, and landing lag frames for teching. This will always result in equal or bigger windows for both of these techniques. The reason this is significant is because Leffen had begun to tell people that his layout had the better L canceling method on its home row, which was false. The default layout has the better L canceling method. Additionally, there are several other reasons for why you should never use Leffen's layout. For one, the only actual benefit his layout gives is that it puts wave dashing on the home row, but this is practically cancelled out by the fact that grab isn't on the home row. Then there's the fact that wave dashing out of light shield is unviable with Leffen's layout. This is because if you're holding the light shield button down with your ring finger on his layout, then you have to pick your ring finger back up in order to wave dash. I tested Leffen's layout a bunch and found that you lose about 5 frames whenever you do this, which isn't an option in a real match. Believe it or not, those aren't even the most egregious things about Leffen's layout. The worst thing about Leffen's layout is that it creates two unergonomic motions, which defeats the entire purpose of the box in the first place. The first one is analog L canceling, and the second one is jump cancelled shine followed by wave dash, which is a common motion for Fox and Falco. On the default layout, you can analog L cancel your aerials while keeping your wrist in one place, but on Leffen's layout, you have to quickly shift to the top row in order to analog L cancel, which will cause pain in the back of your wrist. Similarly, on the default layout, you can comfortably JC shine, then wave dash by pianoing to the left twice. But on Leffen's layout, you have to piano to the left, then to the right, which will irritate your ring finger. This will happen because the middle and ring fingers are the only fingers that don't have their own independent muscles, which is why it's difficult to move them without moving some of your other fingers. It's bad practice for a button layout to make these fingers work against each other when they need to work with each other on a biological level. When you compare the list of pros and cons each of these layouts provide, it becomes obvious that Leffen's layout should never be used. Telling people to use this layout is like telling them to uninstall System32 from their PC. It's something they should never do, unless they willingly want to use a defective product. The problem is that Leffen's narcissism compelled him to find something wrong with the box at all costs. He couldn't just conform to using the box. He needed to coin his own layout, even if it meant misleading people about Melee. Leffen would end up doing this by insisting that digital L cancels are better than analog L cancels, as this would give him the angle that his layout has the better L canceling method on its home row. Over the course of the next few weeks, Leffen would display the willful and malicious intent to lie about this game mechanic. After Leffen began broadcasting on January 5th, the false claim he had made about L canceling quickly made its way to the box Discord server. A moderator named Haystack immediately pointed out that Leffen's L canceling argument was faulty because analog L cancels give you the choice over when to tech, which means they're always equal or better than digital L cancels. Haystack was correct. However, the belief that digital L cancels are better would begin to gain traction just because Leffen had said so. The first attempt to correct Leffen was made just a few minutes later. No one in Leffen's chat had contested what Leffen was saying despite it being wrong, so a box moderator named Slamist felt the need to intervene. He told Leffen that analog L cancels are better than digital L cancels. Take a look at what ended up happening to him.
User Slamist. One timeout? Yes, sounds about right. Melee is not for the average person. Light press, hard press? Yeah, I mean, this guy's just full of shit.
Leffen and Slamist ended up getting into an argument over the subject. Leffen then began roasting Slamist in front of over 1,000 people as to make an example out of anyone who questioned his word. Meanwhile, Leffen's chat laughed and continued to adopt false information.
I'm not saying, to be clear, that I know the best layout. I'm saying that letting you rebind things is an objectively huge positive. You have to be an absolute fucking moron to try to say that not being able to remap is better because your overlord said so. But yeah, hard pressing with L cancel is in general better because it option select attack.
Leffen would end up banning Slamist. Then Leffen began to refer to me as an evil overlord, which shows how personally invested he was in proving me wrong. The argument you just heard Leffen give about option selected techs is incorrect as well. At the time Leffen said this, he didn't know that you get locked out of tech if you press L or R during hit lag. Because of this mechanic, you're supposed to perform the option select he's referring to by analog L canceling during hit lag, then pressing L or R afterward to tech. 6 hours later, Leffen was still spreading the same misinformation.
See the tech? That shows that this man is a wise man that uses hard press to L cancel. Probably means he's on a GameCube controller too. Since most of the box players seem to think that hard press is bad.
This time, another box moderator named Altimore went into Leffen's chat to try to stop the bleeding. Altimore pointed out that what Leffen had just said didn't make sense, since you can always analog L cancel, then manually tech whenever you want to.
You can always manually tech after with Z? Yeah, but it's unergonomic as fuck. Because you have to like press an extra button, and it's really fucking hard.
Leffen was unwilling to forfeit the argument, and so he made the ridiculous claim that analog L canceling is worse because it makes you press an extra button to tech, which is unergonomic. Altimore quickly pointed out that this didn't make sense either, as you can easily just press the L button. Altimore added that Leffen's layout is in fact the unergonomic one, as it forces you to shift your wrist between rows in order to analog L cancel. Altimore then explained to Leffen that a big part of the reason digital L cancels are worse is because if you input them during hit lag, you'll get locked out of tech.
Like if you do an air and it's 5 frame hit lag and you press L there, and then you can tech 5 frames after the L cancel, it doesn't give you a tech.
Leffen had to ask Altimore for clarification about why this tech lockout occurs. Altimore then clarified that when you input a tech during hit lag, the game interprets it as you inputting a tech multiple times, which causes a lockout. Take a look at how Leffen responded.
Why would that not give you a tech though? If you're saying that you can't get a tech if you mash, can't mash tech.
Leffen's response revealed that he didn't know one of the most basic rules of teching, which is that you'll get locked out of tech if you mash the input. Another person in Leffen's chat even intervened to correct him about this detail. At this point, Leffen absolutely needs to forfeit the argument. He flat out doesn't know what he's talking about and needs to educate himself on several mechanics before continuing. Any normal person would realize that they're in the wrong by now, but take a look at what Leffen does instead.
But yeah, exactly. But that means you're landing the move. I don't get it. Yeah, thinking more to it, that means you're landing the move, dude.
Leffen takes 10 seconds to come up with his next faulty argument, which is that being locked out of tech doesn't matter because if your attack connects, that means you're safe anyway. This is a false statement because there are tons of situations in Melee where the attacker is framed negative. If Fox nairs another Fox who ASDIs down, for example, then the first Fox will get shined. Similarly, if Fox drills another Fox who's in shield, then the first Fox will get shined out of shield. In both of these situations, the attacker should extend their tech window by analog L canceling. Altimore and Leffen would end up going in circles for the rest of the night. Eventually, Altimore gave up on trying to get Leffen to stop misinforming people. Then, the next day, Leffen continued to broadcast the idea that digital L cancels are better.
So that's the left layout. Also, it makes L canceling with hard press a lot easier, which I think is clearly optimal.
Leffen was refusing to face the facts just so he could coin his own button layout, and it was taking its toll. The misinformation he was spreading would start to cause mass confusion. Less experienced players were rapidly beginning to believe that the box was designed incorrectly, and that they should L-cancel the wrong way as well. It was eerily similar to when ESAM complained that Ultimate players were treating Leffen's word as law. A week later, another moderator named Otak began to take serious issue with what Leffen was doing. Otak said it was weird for a player as good as Leffen to use such a bad button layout, and that he was actively misleading box users into thinking that there was something wrong with their product. Otak added that it was even worse that Leffen was misinforming people about L-canceling, as this would damage the entire Melee player base. On January 18th, Leffen started to take his fraudulent rhetoric to Twitter. He posted a Twitch clip which explicitly stated that digital L-cancels are better than analog L-cancels in its title for all 300,000 of his followers to see. By this point, Leffen had also implemented chat commands to ramp up the rate at which people would be misinformed. It seemed that the more we tried to educate Leffen, the more he saw that we were growing frustrated, and so he retaliated with even more lies. At this point, Otak had seen enough, and so he confronted Leffen in a separate Discord server about the misinformation he'd been spreading. This would mark the third attempt to get Leffen to stop lying. Just like with Altimore, Otak's conversation with Leffen went nowhere. Leffen would insult Otak multiple times and make generalizations that kept things going in circles endlessly. After Leffen continued to refuse to see Otak's points, Otak gave up on trying to talk to him, and ended the conversation by saying that there's no world in which digital L-cancels should be viewed as a silver bullet solution. In Otak's own words, a much more reasonable stance would be to analog L-cancel, then consciously choose when to tech. These words, unfortunately, never made their way through to Leffen. Leffen's rhetoric would end up causing an indescribable amount of damage over the course of January. I would estimate that hundreds of Melee players began to L-cancel incorrectly and believe that the box was designed incorrectly during this time period. After working on the box for 4 years, witnessing this happen to my community was incredibly disheartening. At first, I would give descriptive responses to customers who asked questions about what Leffen was saying, but as time went on, I began to lose my tolerance, and it showed in my responses. On January 1st, a customer named Treelock said that he was trying out the R and Z swap because it had been recommended by not only Leffen, but another Swedish player named Pipsqueak as well. I responded by saying that Pipsqueak is Leffen's bitch, as to imply that Pipsqueak would simply parrot anything that Leffen said, and that it didn't make the R and Z swap any better. Pipsqueak then cherry-picked this statement and took it to Twitter on February 4th, which made me look like a bad person for saying this about him. His tweet provided no context, but it began to get decent traction. I had now somehow managed to find myself in a bad PR situation because of Leffen's lies. When I saw Pipsqueak's tweet, I responded with a tweet that I've since deleted. The tweet read, frauds like you and Leffen are actively damaging the box community by advising people to swap the locations of R and Z. If you're going to advise people to use a bad button layout, then you've got blood on your hands. Deal with it. I'm sure people still remember this tweet because it gets referenced to this day. No, my tweet wasn't polite whatsoever, but that's because my company had been getting defrauded for the past month by a pathological liar. Unfortunately, Twitter didn't see things this way, and so I ended up getting ripped on for several weeks. Pipsqueak would make follow-up tweets suggesting that people should stop listening to me, and other people made tweets that joked about how much I had taken offense to a button swap. Yet as I've shown you, swapping certain button locations can completely destroy the box, and I was simply trying to protect my customer base. After I deleted my tweet on February 4th, I issued an apology statement in which I said that I'd acted unprofessionally. My apology was insincere and was only meant to perform damage control. I'd done absolutely nothing wrong, and I shouldn't have ever been in this situation. I consider my apology very similar to Samox's statement from December in which he apologized for telling you the truth about Evidence.zip. We're at the point where companies and filmmakers can find themselves in bad PR situations if they don't conform to Leffen's lies. It's incredibly dystopian, but it's also the reality. After seeing me end up in a bad PR situation, Otak actually quit the Melee community that same night. I later asked him if he was really done, and he confirmed that he was, because according to him, Leffen had ruined the community. Otak compared Leffen to Trump in the sense that they both cultivate ignorance in their audiences and plan out everything politically in ways that people don't see. Even after February 4th, Leffen would continue to spread his rhetoric, but now Leffen wasn't just going after L canceling. He was completing the con by going after the box's layout.
But I was thinking that, like, you know, for the layout stuff, like for the box layout, it's actually crazy how much better my layout is. The more I play and the more I think about things, the more I realize, like, how bad the default one is.
Remember when I said that if Leffen were to throw a narcissistic tantrum like this one nowadays, it would cause serious problems? Now you know that I wasn't kidding. Leffen chose to set up his stream every day and knowingly lie about game mechanics in a way that would damage my company's customer base and PR. I even ended up having to make a YouTube video to debunk the lies he was spreading, but it's not like my video undid nearly all of the damage. After I made my video, Axe contacted me in private to thank me for making it. He said that he didn't know why so many people had been L-canceling the wrong way lately, so I told him it was because Leffen had been lying to people. He lied to people day after day after day, and abused the fact that a lie told often enough becomes the truth. Back in 2013, Evidence.zip told us that Leffen was a dark triad who would engage in this type of deceptive behavior. We're now in 2021, and clearly nothing has changed. So the question is, what did Leffen do between 2013 and 2021 that had dark motivations people weren't considering? As it turns out, he did a lot. In my opinion, Leffen's political cons began in 2017, and they all started with when I needed to legalize the box controller I'd been designing. The box has gone on to help thousands of Melee players in need of an ergonomic controller, and so thousands of careers were on the line back when its legality was being decided. But Leffen didn't care about that. He wanted me gone, and so he was going to get the box banned at any cost. On January 19, 2017, I announced to the Melee community that I'd be returning on a controller called the Box. I had just spent a few years away from the game due to hand and wrist injuries, and people were happy to see that I'd not only be coming back, but helping out other Melee players in need as well. Then, the exact same day I made my announcement, Leffen hosted a stream in which he made the following comments.
There's absolutely nothing. There's no proof or even anecdotal evidence the Smashbox is better for your hands. I feel like there's a real concern that other top players could develop severe hand issues as well. Well, his was like, it feels like it's genetic. He has like arthritis and stuff like that. And Hax's was honestly his own. Like, yes, I do worry that other people get hand issues, but I also think that it's 95% at least their own fault, and then like 5% the GameCube controller or whatever.
Everything you just heard Leffen say is false. You just heard him say that there's no proof that keyboard controllers are more ergonomic than GameCube controllers, which everyone knows is untrue. He also lied about my hand injuries by claiming that I have genetic arthritis, which I don't. I have osteoarthritis, which is from wear and tear. The fact that Leffen felt the need to make these lies on the exact day of my announcement made it obvious what was to come. 2 months later, I would encounter Leffen at Summit 4, which took place between March 2nd and 5th, 2017. When I first got to the venue, I saw SFAT, PewPew, Ice, and Leffen playing teams, so I said hi to all of them. Then, within 5 minutes of my arrival, Leffen got up and asked me to speak with him about the box, so I obliged. Him and I then went into a different room. My conversation with Leffen would end up being an interrogation in which he tried to get me to commit to certain lines of logic about how the box would be legalized. Leffen kept asking me questions about GameCube controller mods and in-game mechanics that the box's legality might affect. A week after I got home from Summit, Leffen began to flood Twitter with misrepresentations of everything I had told him. He even spread these misrepresentations to TOs such as Jabali and Mr. Wizard to try to reach a ban verdict as quickly as possible. When people asked Leffen what I thought about his tweets, he would clarify that I was in agreement with him, which wasn't true. And so I told Leffen that he was acting maliciously by putting words in my mouth. This was when things got even weirder. Leffen clarified that he had no malicious intent, but that he had made contact with the engineer who I was working with at the time. To be clear, Leffen lives in Sweden, and my engineer lives an hour away from me in New Jersey. When I saw Leffen's tweet, I realized that he had formed a strategic friendship, as he usually does. I didn't think too much of it at the time, but it would end up coming into play later. A week later, Leffen began to flood YouTube with anti-box propaganda. The first video he made was released on March 21st, 2017. It was only a minute long, and it was called Box Controller Exposed. The video focused on a mechanic called 1.0 Cardinal, which is a mechanic in Melee that causes your analog stick value to increase by about 1% if you can pinpoint the final value along the cardinal. This improves things such as dash speed and DI by about 1%. Since the box is a digital controller, it can pinpoint this value every time, whereas GameCube controllers may struggle to do so. That being said, 1.0 Cardinal is a touchy subject, and it's easy to misconstrue certain things about it through the use of crafty language.
It also affects up or down. This also affects airspeed. It also affects even the smash DI and normal DI. So you can literally DI further on a keyboard or a digital input. Do what you will with this information.
Leffen's video is incredibly disingenuous for several reasons, but the public didn't realize this. For one, the fact that Leffen's video is only a minute long and ends with "do what you will with this information" means it isn't intended to educate people, but to spread fear. There are several arguments Leffen's video doesn't mention, such as the fact that 1.0 is a microscopic advantage that would never warrant banning a controller. Then there's the fact that some GameCube controllers are way better than others at pinpointing 1.0 due to hardware differences, yet those controllers aren't banned. There's also the fact that 1.0 should be fixed on UCF, at which point it isn't even a discussion anymore. Leffen's video wasn't intended to be truthful about any of these things. The very next day, Leffen followed up with another video called Digital Input DI Meta Incoming. What Leffen shows in this video is that if Peach upthrows Fox and he DIs away with 1.0, he will escape her down smash, which he can't do with the value before that. But what Leffen doesn't show you is that this is only true at exactly 0%. Starting at 1%, the value before 1.0 is enough to get Fox out of this combo. Another thing Leffen doesn't show you is that even when Peach upthrows Fox at 0%, she still needs a frame-perfect down smash input in order to hit Fox on the frame before he lands. If Peach is even a frame late, then her down smash will miss. This means that what Leffen shows in his video is practically irrelevant because it needs not one, but two very precise conditionals. Releasing these types of deceptive videos when my career was on the line wasn't a joke, but Leffen's intention wasn't to be honest. It was identical to when you saw him lie about L-canceling for political purposes earlier this year. 2 days later, a tournament called Royal Flush announced that I'd be competing at their upcoming event. Royal Flush had invited me to play on the box, and so I accepted. However, within 2 hours of Royal Flush announcing that I'd be in attendance, Leffen hounded the TOs about redoing their controller rule set. This caused Royal Flush to rescind their invite. When Royal Flush rescinded their invite, I didn't care too much, as my engineer and I were mostly focused on a separate project at the time. Our separate project was called the Arduino. This was an electrical mod that gave the GameCube controller improved capabilities such as dashback, shield drop, and 1.0. While it isn't talked about too much anymore, the Arduino is largely what paved the way for UCF. Even though I was banned from competing in Royal Flush, I was still going to go so that I could see people demo the Arduino for the first time. What I didn't know is that while I was working on the Arduino, Leffen had secretly been making arrangements with my engineer for an Arduino to be given to him at Royal Flush. My engineer had never told me this because he had no idea that Leffen was malicious. However, when I met up with my engineer at Royal Flush, he revealed to me that he'd be giving an Arduino to Leffen later that weekend. Once my engineer told me this, I literally began to shake him by his shoulders. He refused to believe me that we were being sabotaged. I still remember my engineer saying, "I'm sure he just wants to try it out," as if Leffen was just another customer. I had to make it clear to my engineer that he didn't know who the fuck he was dealing with. I then forced him to give me the Arduino back. The strategy Leffen employed here is called triangulation, also known as divide and conquer. This is a manipulation tactic that works by infiltrating a social circle as a third party who disrupts communications. Triangulation can be used to engineer rivalry between people or create confusion, which is what you just saw. We've already seen Leffen triangulate multiple times throughout this video, but this was probably his most strategic one yet, as it brought him close to seizing a device that played a role in legalizing the box. Later that day at Royal Flush, I found myself sitting next to Leffen in the Friendlies room. Armada, Mike Hayes, and Captain Smuckers were there as well. Between everything Leffen was doing, I had begun to reach my limits. I confronted Leffen about the fact that he'd been pumping out propaganda on YouTube, but the moment I did this, he started screaming belligerently to muffle my voice. Leffen then ripped his controller out of the setup he was playing at and started to walk toward the exit door as to avoid having the conversation with me. This got me heated since it showed that Leffen's only goal was to spread lies on social media, and so I screamed back at him to let him know that I knew exactly what he was doing. Leffen later retold this story as though I'd screamed at him for no reason, which has tricked people into thinking that I'm harassive toward Leffen. The same exact day, Leffen had the audacity to come back into the Friendlies room to ask me if he could have the Arduino. He'd found out that I'd taken it away from my engineer, and so he approached me with a smile and a polite voice. When Leffen did this, I told him to fuck off. Leffen then said, verbatim, that Arduino was supposed to be mine. I told him to fuck off again. As Leffen angrily left the Friendlies room, I noticed that he had his phone out. I already knew what this meant, so I followed him out of the Friendlies room and into the hallway. I started to tell Leffen that I would have given him the Arduino if he had good intentions, but he didn't. He was still the same person he was back during Evidence.zip. The entire time I tried to talk to Leffen, he kept his face buried in his phone. He didn't even turn his head to look at me. He then began pacing away from me as he typed something. At first, I tried to keep up with Leffen, but he eventually began pacing so fast that I wasn't going to bother anymore. After I let Leffen get away, I checked his Twitter account, and surely enough, I found a tweet that suggested that I'd done something wrong by not giving him the Arduino. Leffen had typed that tweet out right in front of my face as I tried to get his attention. Later that week, Leffen would also host streams that talked about how I hadn't given him an Arduino that was supposed to be his. This caused my engineer to realize that I was right about Leffen all along. Leffen would continue to flood YouTube with anti-box propaganda during this time. All of his videos were intended to fearmonger and spread misinformation. He would misconstrue several game mechanics, and continue to challenge the fact that ergonomic controllers were even necessary. The lengths he was going to destroy me were unbelievable. Eventually, I couldn't take any more of Leffen's abuse. At Smash and Splash 3, I saw him lose to Zane, which was a major upset at the time. This led to me taking a shot at Leffen on Twitter. I called him out for losing despite the fact that he had notches, which he had constantly been misrepresenting in order to get the box banned. At first, Leffen didn't respond to my tweet for a while, but later that night, he blew things insanely out of proportion. Leffen posted logs of a private conversation I had with him in 2016 in which I came to him with a confession. I'd been suffering from PTSD for 3 years at the time, and I needed help. This PTSD resulted from the chronic harassment and stalking I'd been subject to in 2011 and 2012, and it had been causing me severe insomnia. The reason I used to have PTSD is because I didn't understand psychopathy back when I was a teenager, and so I didn't understand why someone was stalking me so obsessively. Apparently, when I gave Leffen this information, he viewed it as a way to stalk me again in the future while blackmailing me. It's still probably the most evil thing I've ever witnessed. After Leffen posted these logs, he tweeted that he had tried to be nice to me despite how terrible I'd been to him. I know it's hard to believe, but Leffen really did tweet that. Tons of people then told Leffen to take the logs down, so he did. However, when someone told Leffen that he shouldn't have posted the logs under any circumstance, Leffen claimed victim status and told him that he couldn't take my harassment anymore. To be clear, I never harassed Leffen during this entire time period. I only ever confronted him because he was trying to end my career. The same person then pressed Leffen about the fact that it still wasn't okay. This was when Leffen referred to me as his stalker. It's very important to realize that this was a projection, and that Leffen was openly confessing to the fact that he stalks me, just as he was confessing to several of his other flaws back when I showed you some of his other insults. After Leffen projected, he told the person that he was done speaking with them since they insisted on victim blaming. This interaction shows exactly why Evidence.zip urged the reader to understand that Leffen will always claim victim status, and that they need to be able to see through it. Less than a week after this all happened, I released my Arduino project to the general public. Leffen tweeted within a few hours to encourage people not to trust me, and to view my work as if it was research funded by a cigarette company. When I released lengthy box documentation a year later, Leffen made the exact same tweet. Ironically, my box documentation contained nothing but factual information. There was even a long chapter on 1.0 Cardinal, the mechanic that Leffen had spread propaganda about in order to get the box banned. If not for Leffen, I never would have had to write this chapter, but I needed to debunk all the lies he'd been spreading. Leffen ultimately failed to ban the box, but his intentions were clear the whole way through. He wanted to remove me from the community at any cost, even if it meant banning a controller that thousands of people would end up needing. Looking back at it, Leffen's success would have been catastrophic. It would have cost so many players their careers. Between all the cons Leffen's launched at me, there's been a common denominator. He doesn't give a shit about this community. When Leffen wants to defraud someone, he will do it no matter how much collateral damage it causes. So far, you've seen him overrun a free tournament series, teach people to L-cancel the wrong way, and convince people to desecrate their ergonomic controllers. 4 years prior to that, he tried to deny people the right to even use an ergonomic controller in the first place through blackmail and propaganda. Leffen was the only beneficiary in all of these situations. At this point, one of the biggest mysteries is surely how Leffen ever managed to attain hero status within the Smash community. He's done absolutely nothing heroic this far in the video, yet he somehow made people think this to be true of him. The way Leffen achieved hero status was through a series of political cons that would take place over the course of the next 3 years. This is because narcissists will strategically claim victim status and hero status in order to get ahead. Victim status, which you've already seen Leffen claim, allows the narcissist to evade accountability, while hero status allows the narcissist to mobilize people underneath them. But to obtain hero status, the narcissist must create a common enemy, which often comes at the expense of innocent people. Leffen's usage of the common enemy strategy began in 2017 when he realized how good of a target Hungrybox was. HBox's popularity had started to dip after the Big House 7 because of how much he'd been winning at the time, which made him vulnerable. Leffen had been knocked out of this tournament by HBox, but you could tell from his post-game interview that he had nothing but good things to say about him.
Lacked focus, and in those moments, I just died every time, especially against Hungrybox. I played well overall, but then during edge cards and like when he just approached me with Pound, I would just like let up for a second, and then he destroys you. He's really amazing at like noticing your weak points and just instantly killing you for it.
Yeah, he's like real. Dude's reactions are crazy.
Yeah.
It's like there was one moment you just like did like a spot dodge.
People still seem to think that the Leffen HBox beef was just some run-of-the-mill beef, but there was so much more to it than that. The Leffen HBox beef was a calculated attempt to end HBox's career that took place right in front of everybody's eyes. It would also cause extreme damage to the community, as Leffen's cons usually do. I was able to recognize that all of this would happen from the start, having been on Leffen's hit list for years. The problem was that nobody else did. What you need to know is that high mocks like Leffen are opportunists who recognize that the right circumstances need to be there before they can pounce on someone. You saw this earlier when Leffen pounced on the box's legality after years of lying in wait. As for the Leffen HBox beef, what happened here was Leffen decided that if he couldn't beat HBox, then a viable way to dispose of him was to destroy his reputation and push him out of the community. Most people would never consider such an immoral strategy, but the Machiavellian viewpoint is different. HBox's dip in popularity would allow Leffen to inflict serious mental damage by convincing people that he was the enemy. This would also heroize Leffen in addition to increasing his market share. From Leffen's perspective, it was arguably better than doing things the normal way. Because I had just had my controller's legality conned by Leffen for an entire year, I knew exactly why HBox was being targeted at this juncture. Like I said, the first reason was his dip in popularity. Leffen is an opportunist who knows that the right circumstances need to be there, which they were. The second reason was envy. Just as Leffen never liked me because of the fact that I had respected Melee opinions, he couldn't stand the fact that HBox was in his way. And lastly, the third reason was blackmail. Leffen had been blackmailing people ever since the days of Evidence.zip, and we all saw how he blackmailed me during the box legality process. In this case, Leffen's blackmail was the little-known fact that HBox had cheated on his girlfriend. Everyone would find out about this a few years later, but at the time, not too many people knew about it, and we can assume HBox would have preferred to keep things that way. A few weeks after the Big House 7, Leffen's con began when he abruptly decided that HBox was killing Melee. The same person who called Leffen out just a few months earlier for blackmailing me pointed out how much of a U-turn this was from everything Leffen had said about HBox in the past, including during Leffen's Big House 7 interview. I quickly saw how personal things were getting when Leffen tweeted that HBox is a miserable person and that everyone has a story of HBox being shitty toward them just a few days later. Leffen obviously had no business saying these things given how he's treated people, but by now you should know that there's no consistency among the things that Leffen says. Furthermore, neither of Leffen's statements about HBox were true. Having been a part of Evidence.zip, I started to become very worried about where this was headed. A few days after Leffen's tweets, the tournament Summit 5 was held in California. Leffen, HBox, and I were all in attendance at this tournament. HBox has been a close friend of mine for many years, so I confronted Leffen on the very first day of Summit 5 to try to defuse their beef, but it was no use. I knew that HBox was being blackmailed, so I repeatedly told Leffen that HBox's sex life wasn't his business. I also made it clear to Leffen that HBox wasn't the only person guilty of cheating, and that Leffen would be a hypocrite if he continued to go after HBox specifically. Leffen blatantly didn't care about any of this. He spoke to me in a deadpan expression the entire time, and gave me responses that kept the conversation going in circles. I left Summit 5 knowing that Leffen was dead set on ruining HBox. As soon as we all got home from Summit 5, Leffen continued to spread rumors about HBox and misrepresent the way other pro players viewed him. When HBox got fed up and defended himself, Leffen immediately signaled to him that he was being blackmailed. This blackmail would keep HBox silent for the remainder of the feud. In December 2017, Leffen posted a video of himself stabbing a pancake that had a green Jigglypuff drawn on it. This video tells you that Leffen desperately wanted to get rid of HBox. It's identical to when he bought a red Adidas shirt shortly after losing to me at Genesis. Stalking and smear campaigning represents the highest level of desperation on the psychopath's end, and it's exactly what Leffen did in both of these situations. A month later, Leffen released propaganda in the form of a video called One of the Many Reasons to Dislike HBox. The video depicted HBox as the devil and received about 400,000 views. Unfortunately, not nearly enough people realized how malicious this video was. Within the video, an up-and-coming player named Snowy tells a story about how HBox had been rude to him when they met. Leffen sits next to Snowy and encourages him to keep going as he tells his story.
Met him. Yeah, the first time I met him, I asked him for a best of $5, Puff Ditto, and when he found out that I was a Puff, he went his secondaries, he took 2 games, and then after the second game he was like, alright, I don't want to keep playing, and he takes my money, he walks away, and I was wearing the HBox shirt that he made, like the one with the cube.
No!
Yeah, and he says to me, nice shirt, and he leaves. It was...
Are you? No, there's no way.
Yeah, no. I had my friend there. I can. My friend will be here tomorrow. You'll know. Like it was
Dude, this is like a villain story.
No.
Guys, join the resistance.
Not only is the thought of Leffen accusing anyone of being mean toward new players comical, but if you actually look into how Leffen treated Snowy behind the scenes, it becomes clear that Snowy was used. On July 19, 2018, Leffen referred to Snowy as his slave, and on February 7, 2019, Leffen looked to silence Snowy for speaking positively about Jigglypuff. When Snowy tried to defend himself, Leffen accused Snowy of lying. Snowy could also be seen begging Leffen to not influence the community to ban his character. I would end up meeting Snowy at a tournament called Don't Park on the Grass that took place at the end of 2018. I talked to Snowy about the video he starred in, and he told me that he never really meant what he said about HBox. Snowy was mostly starstruck by the chance to hang out with Leffen, and wanted to impress him. Snowy also told me that Leffen was highly abusive toward him, and would repeatedly call him retarded off camera. When I asked Snowy why he would take Leffen's abuse, he told me that being friends with Leffen gave him opportunities, and that it let him talk to other top players in the scene. There's a term called flying monkeys, also known as abuse by proxy, that describes everything you just witnessed. Abuse by proxy is when a narcissistic abuser exploits another person to carry out their agenda, such as launching a smear campaign. Snowy was valuable for Leffen in this case because he gave credibility to Leffen's smear campaign, but after that, he wasn't needed. The reality is that narcissists don't value their proxies as human beings whatsoever, and will typically dump them after there's no longer a good reason to maintain the relationship. As you can tell by now, the Leffen HBox situation never made any sense. It was pot calling the kettle black. The most malicious person in the entire community had made up a narrative that someone else was an abuser, and people believed it. As 2018 went on, Leffen continued to do things like censor HBox's name in his Twitch chat and misrepresent their in-person interactions. When Leffen claimed that HBox begged him to be unblocked on Twitter, for example, I happen to know that HBox politely asked Leffen to settle their beef. Leffen then went and rephrased this in the most vindictive way possible.
And tell me about the set history between these two, Scar.
So Leffen versus HBox has actually been, they have had a long rivalry, and it's gotten a bit personal at times.
It has
These
gotten
guys
a
do
little
not
bit
like
personal.
each other. They don't, kind of oil and water a little bit.
Leffen frequently tweets about, you know, such and such, like, I can't believe this terrible human being. He doesn't say terrible, you know, player. He says terrible human being.
Yeah. It's gotten to that level.
It's gotten to that level. Is killing the game that I love. You know, Leffen's maybe a little bit melodramatic about it, but
maybe
you know.
a little, but that's what we like about him.
The false narrative that HBox is a deplorable person eventually made its way to commentary slots and news outlets such as ESPN. You can tell from the way Scar and Toph spoke about Leffen that inciting mass hatred was a part of his brand at this point, and that the community would condone it too. Unfortunately, the average viewer wouldn't have seen things this way. These broadcasts alone probably brainwashed thousands of people into believing that Leffen was the hero. A week later at Super Smash Con, the social isolation that was destined to come for HBox had finally begun to manifest. The rank 1 player in the world was rapidly losing his support network, and he was starting to crack. There to capitalize on the situation was none other than Leffen, who subtly encouraged people to deal the finishing blow. Like I said earlier, this was all a calculated attempt to end HBox's career, and it damn near succeeded. To show you how stealthy the manipulation that took place right in front of you was, let's juxtapose Genesis 5 and Genesis 6. At Genesis 5, which took place in 2018, Leffen gaslit HBox by refusing to give him a handshake after both of their sets. This was intended to push the narrative that HBox is deplorable. HBox can't be blamed at all for his reaction to it happening the first time, as he didn't deserve any of this. However, evoking that type of a reaction was all part of Leffen's plan.
Oh, man. And a down smash from Hungrybox. Really solid 3-0 for him, man. He will move on.
Ooh, and Hungrybox.
To winners finals. That was for winners finals?
Yep.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, no.
Hey,
Hungrybox sit clean as usual.
That's not a good start.
A year later at Genesis 6, and the aftermath of Leffen's behavior was clear as day. Several competitors tweeted in good faith to let the community know that this type of hatred was unacceptable. However, there was a snake in the grass among them. After an entire year of spearheading the movement against HBox, Leffen trapdoored his way out of the chaos he created in order to boost his reputation. Hardly anyone called fraud on Leffen's tweet either, but HBox's mother sure did, and the fact that she of all people called fraud tells you everything you need to know. People don't realize this, but Leffen is the real reason HBox had a crab thrown at him at Pound 2019. Leffen incited violence without ever directly inciting violence. He puppeteered the HBox con from start to finish, and not enough people connected the dots. When Leffen told the crowd to roar, they roared, and when Leffen told the crowd to sit, they sat. The most incredible part is that Leffen ended up leveraging all of this into a hero narrative. The community either never realized how Leffen had mobilized them, or never had the courage to speak up against it, and so they accepted his hatred as the new normal. Years of Research is probably the con I'll catch the most flack for defending, but there's so much worth talking about here in terms of political angles that were never considered. When people look back at Years of Research, they don't seem to remember it correctly, so I want to share a different perspective. On December 7, 2018, a new Smash title would come out, which presented Leffen with yet another huge opportunity. Realizing how easy it had been to craft a hero narrative within the Melee community, Leffen would now repeat the process within the Ultimate community. Any other content creator would have simply created content to profit off the release of a new Smash title, but Leffen is always willing to take things a step further, and so what he needed was a new hero narrative. Because hero narratives always come at someone else's downfall, Leffen needed to pick a target. You're absolutely not supposed to say what I'm about to tell you, but Salem was conned by Leffen. I discussed this with Mutaking last year, and he agreed. The problem was that Salem went on to say things about the Melee community that couldn't be defended, as M2K put it. M2K and I agreed that Salem was just a nerd who'd been bullied, and said things they probably didn't mean. They became part of Leffen's political agenda when Leffen started harassing them about their opinions on Ultimate with the intention of vilifying someone. None of the arguments Leffen made about Snake being a bad character would end up being correct, but that wasn't the point. Leffen needed to trigger someone quickly, and he would end up doing just that. After Salem posted Years of Research, they ended up losing their entire reputation over the course of 2 days. Normally, I wouldn't have listed Leffen's beef with Salem as a charge against Leffen, but you have to realize that we're now going on the 7th person whose career Leffen has looked to ruin. This is factoring in Chillin, who I put in the same category as Salem. Chillin and Salem weren't necessarily Leffen's political adversaries, but they were still instrumental in Leffen's ascension. Leffen's beef with Chillin was to instill fear and get sponsored more quickly, while his beef with Salem was to milk the Ultimate community of its resources. Salem actually referenced this in Years of Research when they said that there were people who were only interested in profiting off of Ultimate. Salem also pointed out that Leffen's fan base grows alongside his malicious intent, which is completely accurate. Years of Research had all sorts of other problems though, so these things got overlooked. A few months later, Salem lost their sponsor, and Leffen was there to celebrate. By that point, everyone had forgotten that Leffen instigated this beef in the first place, which just goes to show how effective it is to unite people against a common enemy. When Leffen beat Salem half a year later at Super Smash Con, a sea of onlookers watched in awe as the supervillain of Ultimate was defeated, but what they didn't realize was that the real villain had just won. Watching this clip of the crowd is terrifying once you realize that Leffen was the mastermind here, and that Salem was nothing more than a scapegoat so that Leffen could mobilize these people. The situation was so one-sided that even HBox had no choice but to participate in it, despite being vilified by Leffen the year before. Leffen could have picked anyone as his target in this situation, but I'm almost positive I know why he picked Salem. If you look at who won EVO titles for Smash in the Mandalay Bay, the most recent winner at the time was Leffen. Before that, you had HBox, who Leffen had already gone after, and then you had Salem. When you consider the fact that Leffen has a god complex and will target people for trivial reasons like these, it makes perfect sense. Leffen may very well have taken offense to the fact that Salem once stepped foot on the same stage as him, and so he wanted to make it clear that only he was worthy of that stage. This is obviously nothing more than a theory, but it's something to keep in mind. The main reason I bring up the Salem feud is because it shows that certain patterns are being repeated, and those patterns are less innocent than people think. Within less than a year, Leffen vilified 2 different people in order to attain hero status and climb the social ladder. HBox was a political adversary who Leffen weakened, while Salem was a scapegoat for Leffen to mobilize people underneath him. Regardless of where you stand on these feuds, there's no denying that each of them served a purpose. Both times, Leffen was able to control crowds and walk away as the beneficiary without anybody realizing it. The point is that there is a political agenda, and soon you'll know why that agenda will spell the end of this community. Up until now, I've shown you that Leffen will approach every situation with the most profitable political angle he can come up with. He undeniably has a dark triad mentality that believes in exploiting others in order to ascend. But sometimes, exploiting others doesn't mean feuding with people. Depending on the situation, it may be appropriate to become a social justice activist overnight. Following the HBox and Salem feuds, Leffen had begun to transition from a villain to an anti-hero in the eyes of the community. The days of Evidence.zip were over, not that anyone knew what Evidence.zip was to begin with. After saving Smash from 2 separate problems that he created, Leffen was starting to be perceived as a role model, and it couldn't have come at a better time. Last summer, the Smash community witnessed its darkest point when it found out that many of its own were sexual predators. People didn't know what to believe when the victims first started coming out, but before you knew it, the whole world was watching. Unfortunately, if there's anything last summer proved, it's that the Smash community is twice as naive as it thought it was. This is because, just as sexual predators can live among us, the Dark Triad can live among us too. People fail to realize how profitable a Me Too movement is from a business perspective. Most of us would never imagine that someone could be cold enough to view things this way, and that's sadly what allows the Dark Triad to gain the upper hand. The truth is, you should always be skeptical about the people who rush to the podium in these types of situations, especially when you consider how well suited the Dark Triad traits are for it. By taking the helm of a Me Too movement, narcissism is rewarded in the form of worldwide acclaim, psychopathy allows one to remain unemotional throughout the whole process, and Machiavellianism allows one to take advantage of the scattered masses who need a leader. It's the perfect opportunity, but most people would never see it that way. So far, I've explained how Dark Triads strategically claim victim status and hero status in order to manipulate people. There's only one better status to claim than either of these, and it's called virtuous victimhood. This refers to when victim status and hero status are combined. Virtuous victimhood is the strongest signal one can emit because it combines the sympathy of victim status with the admiration of hero status, making it ideal for leeching resources. Virtuous victimhood can't be signaled in every situation, but it can certainly be signaled during a Me Too movement. A Dark Triad is able to emerge as someone who can resonate with victims while also coming across as a leader who victims should stand behind. This is why it was never a matter of if Leffen would show up, but rather a matter of when. Surely enough, Leffen would begin tweeting frequently on June 28th. The tweets he made over the course of the next few weeks gave victims hope and empowerment, and caused him to become the community's beacon. Leffen's actions were showered with praise by community leaders, and not a soul stopped to question his intentions. His ability to take the helm of Me Too so easily despite his dark past made me realize how wide the gap between perception and reality is within this community, and that the situation was worse than I thought. If you listen closely to what Leffen says in this clip that Rishi tweeted, you'll start to realize that something went wrong here.
Yeah, I also agree that saying you stan, while I appreciate it if it's about me, I still think it's bad. You should hold me accountable. If I'm not entertaining, if I'm not doing shit like that, then don't fucking follow me. Don't watch me. I'm not your friend. I'm an entertainer. I'm a pro player. You shouldn't assume that I am a top. Just because I'm a top player, that I'm a top person, that I'm a great person, because you don't know me. It is very easy as a streamer to do your bad shit during the hours you don't stream.
By July 2nd, the number of allegations had begun to ramp up, and so Leffen made a YouTube video in which he discussed the situation. He also made a second video on July 15th. These videos received over 1 million hits combined. I'll play a couple of quotes from them that I've selected.
The people these people hurt don't deserve to just be a summary and just to be like, these people overall have been abused, right? So I'm not going to try to do that here. People know about the Evidence.zip, and although I do not think that that was deserved, like being banned for it, I do definitely agree that I acted like a fucking jerk and that I need to do I need to be much, much better going forward, is what I realized. Some people in this community, whether you like it or not, have some kind of power, whether it's being a top player, a TO, a just community figure, whatever it is. Heck, man, all it seems to take now is that, like, it really does seem like people just take whatever they can and just use it to either abuse, blackmail, or try to hide what they have done. I have no doubt that we will be seeing more stories come out, and I am incredibly proud of everyone for speaking out. I'm not sure, honestly, that I have always been, I would have been able to speak out on some of this. This is extremely, extremely serious stuff and can do very long, serious mental damage to people. Seeing what these people that I thought, I thought they were my friends, or at least people I knew, do such disgusting things, right? Like, I never could have imagined that they would do such disgusting things. And then instead of apologizing or owning up to what they did, they try to lie and manipulate people instead. People have been praising me for speaking up and saying that I've been using my platform for the right thing, but I'm still not confident that I did everything correctly. In fact, I know I didn't. And I still feel like the real hero here isn't me. It's the people that were brave enough to speak up, knowing what harassment they would face. I don't think they get enough credit. And honestly, I've been struggling with feelings of guilt because I've gained a lot of subscribers, a lot of followers, and attention because of these awful things happening. And I know many people have struggled with the same feelings.
With the information we have, none of these quotes make any sense coming from Leffen. The first quote is a projection because Leffen states that he won't summarize victims, then proceeds to summarize Evidence.zip in about 10 seconds. As we know, Evidence.zip deserves much more time than that. Similarly, the second quote is a projection because Leffen is regularly abusive and has used blackmail as one of his go-to strategies throughout his career. The third quote is also a projection because Leffen knows that he himself is aware of causing several people's mental health to decline. The fourth quote is a projection as well because after Leffen was banned for Evidence.zip, he issued a fake apology that manipulated North Americans and the media. And finally, the fifth quote is a projection because we have Leffen on record for leeching money and fame from the Smash community on several occasions, including this one. These quotes aren't the focal points of Leffen's video, they're just scattered ones I wanted to show you. The focal point of Leffen's video is actually a victim testimony in which he talks about a road trip he took when he was younger in which he was allegedly physically abused. Before we listen to Leffen's testimony, I want to show you something he prefaces it with.
That said, though, I do think in general, as a general, you need to believe victims, especially if they don't have a very credible reason to lie. And even then, I generally think you should start out by believing them.
What Leffen just said is highly manipulative. By saying this, he conditions you to believe victims, which is horrible advice since victims can be just as deceptive as abusers. A few minutes later, Leffen gives his victim testimony. Please listen to all of it very closely.
When I was, before I was banned, I went to my first tournament over in the United States. And I've told this story many times before, so I'm not going to go into great detail about it. But as a 16-year-old, I went there, traveled with an RV around California and the nearby states for about 2 weeks. And there were about 10 people in that RV. So it was a lot of people, many people adults. And during this time, there was one particular player that physically abused me, like basically slapped me extremely hard across the face several times over
basically nothing. I sat in his seat. I was playing Smash and he wanted to go to sleep. His alarm didn't wake him up. And took about 8 times before someone said anything, and no one really said anything. This player also ended up stealing money, never paying back people thousands of dollars. And some people are still friends with this person to this day. And I'm not saying this to try to make a pity party of myself. I think in general, I took this situation and I dealt with it pretty well. And I was pretty bratty, you know. I stood up for myself. I always try to take fights verbally. Of course, I never fought anyone physically, but I'm not gonna say that I didn't like do anything to deserve any kind of lashback whatsoever. But I definitely did not deserve to be physically assaulted several times. But since that day, I was obviously extremely mad at the other people who I looked up to before, who I saw as full grown adults, for not doing anything. And ever since that day, I basically vowed to myself that when that happens next time, when I'm the fucking adult, I'm not gonna just sit by and just be like, oh, I hope someone else look to someone else. I'm gonna step in myself and say something. And honestly, I thought after that happened, I was obviously banned for the whole thing with Evidence.zip. And that person in particular quit the scene. I stood up for myself when he tried to come back to me. He wanted to talk it over a dinner meal, and he came and hugged me from behind and said, let's talk things out. And he asked me to pay for his meal. Obviously, I just told him to go fuck himself and basically stood up for myself.
Before we continue, I want to be clear about one detail within Leffen's testimony.
I was playing Smash and he wanted to go to sleep. His alarm didn't wake him up. And took about 8 times before someone said anything, and no one really said anything.
In Leffen's video, he states that he was slapped 8 times, but on April 29, 2012, Leffen told this exact same story on Smashboards, and he stated that he was only slapped once. This means that Leffen modified the story in order to make it sound like more of an assault. When I heard Leffen's new testimony, I reached out to some of the Swedes who I happened to know were on this road trip, which took place during the weeks leading up to Genesis 2. The first Swede I reached out to told me that they knew Leffen was slapped once, and that they remembered Leffen telling them that he was slapped a second time, but that 8 times was definitely a lie. The next Swede I reached out to was Armada. Armada said the exact same thing, which is that a second slap may have happened, but that 8 was clearly a lie. Armada added that Leffen had been telling a botched version of this story 6 to 8 weeks earlier on his stream. The next piece of evidence is a testimony that was written over 8 years ago. Earlier on in this video, I showed you excerpts from Evidence.zip, but I omitted the third Swedish player's testimony. The reason I omitted this testimony is because it's the most important one in Evidence.zip, and I needed to save it for later. This testimony was written by a smasher named C. C is the person who slapped Leffen, and he just so happened to testify about the Genesis 2 road trip. C's testimony is cleanly divided into 6 sections, each with its own title. I'll be showing you his testimony in its entirety. As you can see, Leffen wasn't being anywhere near truthful in his 2020 testimony, but that shouldn't surprise you by this point. Not only was Leffen's testimony filled with several misrepresentations, but he actually seems to have been the abuser in this situation. This past March, I contacted C to ask him if he'd seen what Leffen said about him last summer. C took a moment to watch Leffen's video, then explained that this was a standard victim narrative from Leffen. C also clarified that he had slapped Leffen once in response to extreme harassment. Leffen had tried to sabotage their hike in several ways, as well as the atmosphere of the entire trip. This was after C fought for Leffen to be included on the trip in the first place. While C didn't approve of what he did, he also couldn't say he overreacted, all things considered. C commented that Leffen is highly manipulative and sociopathic when it comes to these things. To add validity to what C is saying, you should know that dark triads will go out of their way to sabotage people's goals, which can include trips and vacations. The way C described Leffen socially isolating him throughout the trip is one-to-one with what this article says. C pointed out that several smaller details within Leffen's testimony were also lies, and that Leffen had been spreading these exact same lies for years. For example, C had borrowed $600 for this trip, which Leffen rephrased as C stealing thousands of dollars. C had also offered to share a pizza with Leffen, which Leffen rephrased as C trying to force Leffen to buy a pizza for him. C then clarified that Leffen had jammed a plane seat into his knee twice on the flight home, which caused C knee pain for weeks. Leffen ignored C's initial request not to do this again, which is why C slapped him a second time. Leffen left this part of the story out of his video. From there, our conversation shifted to the fact that Leffen has caused people like me and HBox insane amounts of damage with lies in recent years. C wasn't surprised to hear this. He said that people should have known that Leffen is a pathological liar by now. I then brought up the fact that on top of everything else Leffen's done, hijacking a Me Too movement isn't a joke, and that Leffen turned out to be an actual threat to society just like Evidence.zip prophesized. C agreed, adding that Leffen potentially deserves to be in jail seeing as how he tries to ruin other people's lives and reputations. I'm inclined to agree with C here for anyone wondering. C then explained that Leffen wants to dehumanize people and get people to view them as though they don't deserve empathy, just as minority groups were viewed in the past. According to C, Leffen will do anything to acquire influence, and wants people to join in on his agenda of treating people without any remorse. I then raised the possibility that Leffen studied totalitarian handbooks such as Mein Kampf, since he had to have learned this from somewhere. C agreed that it was possible. Then he pointed me toward the teachings of Edward Bernays. Bernays was an Austrian-American pioneer in the field of public relations and propaganda. He described the masses as irrational and subject to herd instinct, and outlined how skilled practitioners could use crowd psychology to control them in desirable ways.
There's this saying that I like, that is, all it takes for evil people to succeed is for good people to do nothing. And I really do think that's true. In my opinion, the world is not filled of majority evil people. I think that's something that people tell themselves in order to kind of put blame away from themselves, that they couldn't have done anything, everyone's bad, and if I'm bad, I'm just part of the majority. I really do think that the majority of people are either decent or good. However, many good and decent people do not do enough, myself included.
Back when you heard Leffen say that, you probably thought he was speaking from the good guy's perspective. He wasn't. He was telling you how easy it is for him to exploit the people of the Smash community. This might be tough to process, but Leffen didn't mean a word he said to any of you last summer. His involvement with Me Too was a facade, just like his hero status is. Leffen got involved with Me Too in order to draw a crowd and mobilize it underneath him, just as he's done several times before. The ninth and final charge against Leffen is one that also took place during last summer's Me Too movement. Up until now, I've shown you how a Me Too movement presented Leffen with a golden opportunity for resource transfer. Leffen gained about 15,000 followers in a few days, built massive loyalty with those followers, and made plenty of money along the way. But those weren't the only benefits a Me Too movement presented Leffen with. The ability to implicate other people as sexual predators presented Leffen with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for resource drain as well. So far, we've seen Leffen drain 2 of his political adversaries in recent years. Both times, Leffen made it clear that his intention was to end the other person's career in order to secure his footing within the community. This is why when Me Too would end up presenting Leffen with the opportunity to take down the only person left in the community with a larger following than his, he obviously wasn't going to pass it up. Leffen wouldn't just use the Me Too movement to grow his brand, he would also seize control of the community through the elimination of Zero, who had the largest following in Smash prior to being banned. Something I want to be clear about is that this section of the video should be viewed separately from the fact that Zero was deemed guilty. It is simply intended to establish that Leffen was personally invested in Zero's downfall, and that Zero's trial was fraudulently administered. This is obvious based on the fact that Leffen wasn't approaching the Me Too movement with pure intentions, but rather with the dark intention of increasing his market share. At that point, we have to assume that everything Leffen did during the Me Too movement was done with this goal in mind. According to what we know, Jisoo approached Leffen on July 2nd, 2020 for advice about coming forward with her allegations against Zero. This is what it says in Leffen's Twitlonger about the Jisoo and Zero situation, which was posted on the morning of July 3rd. As if this story couldn't get any darker, what Jisoo didn't know is that when she approached Leffen for advice, she approached someone who had not only just hijacked the entire Me Too movement, but would also gladly cancel Zero in the process. Zero was the only person left in the Smash community with a larger following than Leffen, and so the situation had practically fallen into Leffen's lap. These are the types of benefits Leffen was bound to receive after duping the entire community into trusting him. The reason Leffen made his Twitlonger in the first place was because people didn't initially believe Jisoo's allegations. On July 2nd at 8:10 p.m. EST, Jisoo alleged that Zero had shown her hentai when she was 15, but people didn't believe her at first because she didn't provide any evidence. This led to Leffen stepping in the next morning at 5:01 a.m. EST. Leffen's Twitlonger was intended to turn the tide back in Jisoo's favor, but it was riddled with so much manipulative language that I knew Leffen had a vested interest in canceling Zero the moment I read it. I also knew that Zero would end up getting cancelled as soon as I read Leffen's Twitlonger, simply due to how these situations always play out whenever Leffen's involved. Leffen's Twitlonger begins and ends by clarifying that Leffen would like to remain friends with Zero after this is all said and done, and that he simply wants the best for his friend. These statements are blatantly insincere, especially when you consider where they're placed. Leffen even clarifies in the first statement that he hasn't spent much time with Zero, and so him claiming that Zero is his friend doesn't make any sense. From there, Leffen makes 4 more statements that either clarify or imply that what Zero did isn't that bad, and that nobody is trying to cancel Zero. Of all the times we've seen Leffen project, this is probably the easiest one to see through. Yet another issue with Leffen's Twitlonger is his constant use of the word nuanced. He uses this word a total of 5 times, which is not only excessive, but also strange when you consider that Jisoo's allegations weren't nuanced at all. Leffen even apologizes in the final paragraph by saying, "I'm sorry this has been a lot of words without any clear conclusions." All in all, most of Leffen's Twitlonger doesn't actually tell you anything, and reads as though it was written by someone who was on drugs. The term for the way Leffen speaks throughout his Twitlonger is called word salad. Word salad is a narcissist way of spouting meaningless sentences that can muddle what they're really saying. In this case, Leffen's word salad caused every single person who read his Twitlonger to make a crucial oversight. There's only one part of Leffen's Twitlonger that actually matters, and it's a testimony he gives toward the end. Leffen's testimony talks about how he allegedly witnessed Zero sharing hentai with 1 or 2 Japanese smashers in a hotel room at Apex 2013. According to Leffen, this made it more likely that Jisoo's testimony was truthful. There's a problem with Leffen's testimony that I want to highlight. At the time of Apex 2013, Zero was 17 years old. This means that Zero was legally a minor, and so if any of the Japanese players were 18 or older, they'd have been guilty of the same crime Zero would later commit against Jisoo. Zero would end up confirming that the Japanese players in question were in fact older than him. If Zero was a minor at Apex 2013, then why didn't Leffen bother to open a case against the Japanese players who were in the hotel room? Furthermore, why did Leffen phrase his testimony as though Zero was the guilty party in this situation? According to Leffen, Zero is to be blamed regardless of whether he's the minor or not. This is a major loophole in Leffen's logic that no one caught. It proves that he was never actually invested in serving justice to sexual predators. Leffen specifically wanted Zero gone because he was a profitable takedown. The manipulative language and double standard within Leffen's Twitlonger is eerily reminiscent of when he smear campaigned Hungrybox 2 years prior. When Leffen posted the video about HBox that would receive 400,000 views, he assured people that he wanted to keep out of the drama, which obviously wasn't his intention. Leffen also portrayed HBox as being abusive toward a player named Snowy, when Snowy was nothing more than a stepping stone for Leffen to enact his smear campaign. By half a year later, Leffen would be on the verge of fully pushing HBox out of the community. Leffen didn't need half a year to pivot toward his true intentions this time around. Just 17 minutes after Leffen posted his Twitlonger, he was already tweeting in a way that suggested that Zero was a criminal who ought to be cancelled. This would have been perfectly fine if not for the fact that Leffen had just assured us that he wasn't trying to cancel Zero. There was no emotional consistency among anything Leffen was saying or doing. As the days went on, more information would come out, and Leffen would continue to administer Zero's cancellation. On July 4th, Leffen made a particularly brutal tweet in which he leaked DMs of Zero reaching out to him to talk. Many people raised an issue with this tweet, so I want to shed some insight into why it happened. 8 years ago, when C testified for Evidence.zip, he explained that Leffen is a highly sadistic individual who will decline any invitation to speak with his prospects. Leffen will, in fact, misrepresent these invitations on social media as to vilify the other person. We've already seen Leffen do this to multiple people. He did it to C when he claimed that he defended himself from C in his YouTube video. He did it to me when he claimed that I screamed at him for no reason at Royal Flush, and he did it to HBox when he claimed that HBox begged him to be unblocked. With that information in mind, Zero never had a chance of speaking to Leffen in this situation, but Zero didn't know that. Neither did the people on Twitter who watched Leffen leak these DMs, but many of them were still able to gauge that Leffen was acting maliciously. Several people accused Leffen of never meaning what he said when he called Zero his friend, and being personally invested in Zero's downfall. One person wrote that Leffen was prepped to gain a lot financially from the situation, while another wrote, "There's something off about you. I respect you speaking up and standing with the victims, but in this particular case, it seems that you never really liked Zero at all, and you were hoping that something like this would happen." Everyone who took this stance was sadly correct. Several other people expressed that what Leffen was doing could potentially drive Zero to suicide, especially considering that Zero was known to have struggled with depression. Leffen responded to one of them by saying, "Don't you dare put his mental health on me. Mental health is a serious issue, but being depressed is not an excuse to get away with doing bad things." This tweet is ridiculous when you consider that in the fake apology Leffen gave after Evidence.zip, he blamed everything he had done on depression and other similar issues. Just because Leffen included a disclaimer that said he wasn't trying to excuse anything doesn't mean that his intention wasn't to do so. On July 9th, Leffen would make another antagonizing tweet in response to Zero announcing that he was in therapy and looking to better himself. Leffen wanted to make absolutely sure of the fact that Zero was gone for good, no matter what toll his actions took on Zero's mental health. Unsurprisingly, it was later revealed that Zero had entered a suicidal state following the events of last summer. All eyes were on Leffen when this news came out, and so he responded by saying that he wished Zero well. Amazingly, this was all it took for Leffen to take the target off of his back. As someone who's dealt with Leffen firsthand, I need you to know that he would probably prefer if Zero was dead. I say this because back when Leffen blackmailed me about my mental health issues, I remember thinking to myself that there are plenty of people who would have killed themselves in that scenario. Leffen even doubled down 3 years later when Metagame aired by bringing up my issues again as a way of discrediting Evidence.zip. The point is, Leffen has no empathy or remorse, and only made his tweet about Zero to protect himself. One last thing I want to show you is that Leffen would have gladly used Me Too to take out HBox as well. When rumors of HBox allegations began to spread, Leffen quickly implemented chat commands in preparation for them. He wanted to leverage Me Too as hard as possible by not only taking the helm, but also by taking out both of the people whose social media followings rivaled his. All in all, Leffen's actions during the Me Too movement reveal what a snake he really is, and should leave no doubt as to his intentions. Hey everyone, thanks for making it to the end of the video, or if you skipped here, that's totally fine too, since I'll be recapping a bunch of the information that I've given to you throughout this video, and I'll be explaining to you what all of it means. Unfortunately, once you know what all of this means, it paints a pretty dark picture for the status quo of the Smash community, and it's really important that everybody weighs in on this, because whether you're a top player, or a TO, a community leader, or even a casual player, this is going to have an impact on your future within this community. And that's because there is a real argument for basically usurping the person currently running the show within this community based on heinous acts of deception and malicious intent. Just a long, long history of those two things. And now that a lot of that's been laid out clearly for you, I think that angle should make a lot of sense. So the first thing that I want to start by showing you is a slide of a dystopian society. These are widely regarded dystopian traits. And as you can see, just about everything on this list is currently being imposed on the Smash community. What you're witnessing in front of your very eyes right here in the Smash community is an attempt to basically seize the throne at the expense of every single other member of this community. The people are being dehumanized, they're being watched, they're being taught how to think, and these are all very totalitarian qualities that are reviled, just historically reviled. You're not supposed to allow this to happen to your community, but the reality is there is a real attempt being made here to control people in this manner. So let's talk about why no matter where you are on the social ladder or what your role is within this community, you should be very concerned with the status quo. And I'll start from my perspective as a top player. So as a top player, your concern should be what I call the hit list. The reason I know about the hit list is because I was the first one who had the misfortune of being added to it. And that was all the way back in 2011 because I was a well-respected theory crafter on Smashboards, and Leffen happened to take an issue with that. What he immediately signaled to me was that my good standing in this community was actually going to be put in jeopardy, simply because I had lots of opinions about this game that went against his. He started to make very real attempts to undermine my credibility, and that has since evolved into eternal beef. Here we are 10 years later, and he's still behaving maliciously toward me in an attempt to get me out of the community whenever he has the opportunity to. Now, over time, I watched the hit list expand. I saw other people join the hit list, and they joined a hit list without knowing that they had joined one. People like Hungrybox and Zero probably didn't even realize that they were a part of a repeating trend. And when you look at who is getting added to this hit list, it actually becomes clear as day what's going on. Because like I said, it all started 10 years ago with an attempt to shut down a well-respected theory crafter who had rhetoric that posed a threat. But then it evolved to people who held the largest market share in the community. If you look at the top 3 people with the largest market share of all time in Smash, it's Zero, Leffen, and Hungrybox. And Leffen has looked to snake the other 2 out of their careers the moment that he had a window of opportunity to do so. So it's clear as day what's going on. Once you put it all together, what he is doing is he's actually looking to consolidate his power within this community by eliminating the people who pose a threat to his rhetoric or market share. He's actually looking to purge them, which is a completely totalitarian strategy. And what that does is it destabilizes your ability to create a career in this game, because you have to realize that you're always being watched. You're always being watched, and if you ever theoretically start to pose a threat to rhetoric or market share, you may become subject to an attempt to strike you down, to keep you weak. And something else worth noting is that every time these hits take place, there is massive collateral damage onto the community. For example, if Leffen had gotten his way with me back in 2017, thousands of people would be physically unable to play the game right now because the box wouldn't be legal. Similarly, in 2021, when he overran Hax's nightclub, he displayed the intent to make people from the East Coast have to subscribe to him on Twitch rather than play in a free tournament series that had just been set up for them. And then also in 2021, around the same time, when he decided to intervene with the box's button layout, he was willing to teach hundreds of people how to L-cancel the wrong way just so he could grow the Leffen brand. He actually spread false information throughout the entire community just so he could be the sole beneficiary. And then I actually ended up having to apologize for that. I was the one who ended up in a bad situation, despite the fact that I was working the entire time to protect my customers. So none of these things make any sense. Everything that I just described is completely backwards. And it extends to the other hits as well. When he conned Hungrybox, for example, he was willing to spread mass hatred throughout the entire community. He was willing to exploit another innocent player in order to enact his smear campaign. He made crowds become hostile and violent, something that has never happened before in this community. And Hungrybox's mother even signed on Twitter to tell you that something has clearly gone wrong here, and no one was listening to her. Then during the Zero Con, I mean, don't get me wrong, Zero deserved to be cancelled, but he didn't deserve to be put into a suicidal state, which undeniably Leffen had a lot to do with. And then amazingly, all Leffen has to do is insincerely wish Zero well at the end of all that to get away scot-free. So he's getting away with murder time and time again, and it's having a massively destructive effect on the upper echelon of this community. But the next thing I want to talk about is how it's having a destructive effect on the masses as well, because totalitarianism is not just about consolidating your power over the upper echelon, it's also about controlling the masses effectively. And one of the earliest things I showed you in this video was when Esam raised the concern that Leffen seems to have established a culture where his word is to be treated as law. And that is very much so an accurate statement. But I want to explain how this was done, because there is a method to the madness. There are steps that have been followed by practically every totalitarian throughout history. And ultimately, those steps have to do with crowd psychology. So the first way that you know that you're living in a totalitarian state is that the person with the highest follower account in this community does not allow you to view his Twitter account unless you sign an agreement to agree with everything that he says. This is the strategy that I call pest control, which is where Leffen makes it clear that anyone who does not conform to his beliefs is going to be blocked and basically left out of the party, because when someone with a massively high follower account decides to block everybody who dissents from them, what it does is it divides their community into those who conform and those who don't. And this creates massive illegitimate pressure to conform, which can then be exploited because it creates the illusion of trustworthiness and correctness. And in this era of social media that we're now living in, I actually advise for this strategy to be forbidden when you consider how dangerous it can potentially be. So the first layer of crowd psychology that you're seeing is that Leffen's followers are basically selectively chosen, which is a massive advantage because normally just because someone follows you doesn't mean that they also agree with everything that you have to say. But in Leffen's case, a much higher percentage of his followers are going to automatically agree because they understand that they actually have to. Otherwise, they're not allowed to even follow him. So now, on top of that, there are actually two more layers of crowd psychology that are pressuring people to conform even further. And these are basically the two more traditional layers that you will see in just about any totalitarian society. The ones that I'm referring to are fear and love. So let's go to a quote from Niccolo Machiavelli. This is the Italian diplomat who Machiavellianism is actually named after. So Machiavelli coined a lot of these strategies for ascending to power politically. And one of his most famous quotes is, "It is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both," which implies that both of these things are great, but fear is the better of the two. So starting with fear, just as I told you that top players are basically under surveillance, meaning Leffen is keeping track of who poses a threat to his rhetoric or market share, Leffen is doing the same for the masses as well. The masses are also under surveillance, meaning he scans social media to make sure that the masses are acting in line with the way that he wants them to behave. And this creates fear. This is called a menticidal assault. It keeps people on their toes, and even when Leffen's not actively attacking people, it's still in the back of people's minds that whatever they tweet may not be in line with what Leffen would want them to say, because they never know when the next menticidal assault will come. So this has a psychologically damaging effect on people. It destabilizes them. And at that point, the person is destabilized. They don't know what to think. They don't know what opinions to express. So now they need someone to retrain them. And that person who retrains them is, of course, going to be Leffen himself. So notice how after he floods the community with all of this fear, the same person is then flooding the community with propaganda as well. So now this propaganda starts to be enforced as law through massive amounts of illegitimate pressure. And that's how Leffen's rhetoric is able to infest the community so effectively. Now, going back to the Machiavelli quote, believe it or not, there's still yet another layer of crowd psychology that Leffen has working in his favor. So the Machiavelli quote implies that while fear is better than love, it is still very useful to be loved for obvious reasons. If you are loved, then people will gladly support you. So the next step that you know you're living in a totalitarian state is that Leffen is both feared and loved. There is a hero-villain disconnect. People view Leffen as a villain who has reformed and become a hero, which is never actually the case. In the real world, this is not a real thing. What actually happened here is a villain realized that hero status would be beneficial to him, and so he made it his goal to obtain it through the use of a self-engineered hero narrative, meaning he threw other people under the bus in order to heroize himself. Specifically, he threw H-Box and Salem under the bus. But you see, the self-engineered hero narrative is so effective that people tend to not even remember that it was self-engineered. They quickly forget, and the person who perpetrated it is able to walk away as a hero, and now they've got that working in their favor too. So now the masses are so beyond brainwashed at this point. They are so dehumanized, so regressed, so painfully unaware that they are being leveraged as statistics that when a Me Too movement breaks out last summer and Leffen quickly takes the helm as their hero, they fail to realize that they are being hoarded and recruited yet again. They don't even suspect that this is yet another socioeconomic scam and that Leffen is walking away as the winner for the millionth time. They don't see that there's someone in the background saying that Leffen actually deserves to be put in jail for the false statements that were made about him, saying that Leffen is utilizing crowd psychology in order to control massive droves of people. They don't see any of this. All they see is this illusion that they've been taught to believe is real. They don't understand that the community is now participating in massive political fraud and that these videos are receiving 1 million hits, and the entire world at this point is being deceived into believing that Leffen is someone who he is not. So these problems, they compound on top of each other, and the biggest problem of all is that this upcoming weekend, the press is actually gearing up to lie to you yet again, to make you believe that none of this is actually what's going on. And that's because, of course, Leffen controls the press. Leffen controlled the press back in 2014 to 2016 when he first influenced them to erase the truth about Evidence.zip, and now he's controlling them yet again. This time he's controlling Samox, the person who basically built this community into what it is today. Samox has actually been subdued. Samox is now the head minister of propaganda for the regime. You're going to receive a documentary this upcoming weekend that is intended to cause you to descend further and further into the pits of totalitarianism. And if you didn't have this video, honestly, that may just very well have been checkmate. But now, luckily, I'm in a win-win situation, whether that documentary broadcasts or not, because either they pulled the plug on it, as they should, or they broadcast it, and that will reveal how bad of a spot we truly are in, because now you will see that the press is actually lying to you. To conclude the video, there is no denying that something massively evil has infested the Smash community. Between the hits being placed on top players, the dehumanization of casual players, and the complete control over the press, believe it or not, you are actually witnessing a modern-day totalitarian regime. And so I've come to inform the Smash community of these injustices in the hopes that it will spark change. So now that the Smash community knows the truth, I think it's time for us to take back the free world. Thank you for watching.